In a land where power wears a suit and the spotlight never dims, the weirdest stories don't come from fiction, they come from the Oval Office. Forget what your textbooks told you. Behind every portrait, every monument, is a trail of bizarre habits, haunted bathtubs, coded nicknames, and jelly beans by the ton. These are the strangest truths about the men who ran the free world, flawed, fascinating, and just plain weird. This isn't history. This is the most bizarre facts about US presidents. George Washington. He didn't want to be king. He didn't even want to be president. But they gave him the job anyway, the first one. The guinea pig. The man who would set the tone for an entire country. And George Washington, stiff-backed and powdered to perfection, decided to start things off by terrifying everyone with how weirdly serious he was about everything. He was obsessed with punctuality, feared being buried alive, and hated shaking hands. He bowed instead, formal, dignified, awkwardly medieval. If Washington was a vibe, it was 18th century stoic with a phobia of intimacy. This is the man who never lived in the White House, but definitely lived inside his own head. He once demanded that his body be kept above ground for 3 days after death just in case he was, not entirely dead yet. A reasonable concern in the 1700s. But Washington didn't just plan for his death. He curated it like a paranoid museum exhibit. He wore padded underwear to maintain a majestic silhouette, powdered his real hair instead of wearing a wig, and hired painters to make him look cooler than he actually was. He wanted to look like a statue even when he danced, which he did often and with wild abandon. Yes, despite being America's most rigid father figure, Washington loved dancing. He'd whirl around ballroom floors with a sense of rhythm so intense you could mistake him for possessed by the spirit of aristocratic revelry. And let's talk about his dental horror show. The man didn't have wooden teeth. That's a myth. What he did have was something infinitely more disturbing. Dentures made of ivory, gold, and the teeth of enslaved people. He literally bought teeth. Not from dentists, from people. That is not a fun fact, it's a morbid window into the reality behind the powdered pageantry. Despite his legendary military career, Washington was terrified of public speaking. He kept his speeches short, mumbled through them, and avoided the podium like it owed him money. When he did talk, he sometimes referred to himself in the third person because of course he did. He also never swore, rarely smiled, and was known to lose his temper privately, only to re-emerge moments later with perfect composure, like an 18th century Hulk in silk stockings. He named his dogs things like Sweetlips, Drunkard, and Vulcan. He threw himself into mule breeding as if the fate of democracy depended on hybrid livestock. He tried and failed to raise silkworms, carried an unshakable fear of owls, and insisted on military-style uniforms even after retirement. This wasn't just about appearances. Washington needed control. Over his image, over time, over reality itself. But there was something haunting about him too. He had a persistent cough, likely caused by tuberculosis. He collected military uniforms. He wrote and rewrote etiquette rules as a teenager, memorizing over 100 codes of behavior like he was programming his own future statue. He believed in bloodletting, even as he died, and approved it for his final moments, a decision that may have killed him faster. He kept a spy ring. He used invisible ink. He funded covert operations with secret codes. He was the founding father and the founding conspirator. George Washington was a man so obsessed with seeming above human weakness that he became a kind of national ghost while still alive. When he died, his step-granddaughter burned his personal letters with Martha. Why? Maybe because they were too romantic. Maybe because they revealed too much. Or maybe, just maybe, Because even the most mythic man in American history was desperately afraid of being known. And that's the legacy of George Washington. Not just the father of the country, but the father of all presidential weirdness. A man who helped create a nation, then stepped back into the shadows like a powdered phantom. But what happens when the next guy doesn't want to be a phantom? What if he wants to be remembered loudly, stubbornly, and with every anxious heartbeat recorded? Enter John Adams. John Adams. John Adams was many things. Founding father, second president of the United States, co-author of the Declaration of Independence, but he was also, quite possibly, the most neurotically fascinating man to ever hold the office. Where George Washington was all gravitas and marble-jawed myth, John Adams was pure, unfiltered humanity, brilliant, insecure, obsessive, and almost cartoonishly candid about his own weirdness. Let's start with the manure. Yes, manure. Adams didn't just dabble in fertilizer, he was obsessed with it. He wrote entire letters, long and detailed, about compost ratios and the magical properties of dung. In a world of powdered wigs and revolutionary ideals, John Adams was out there, elbow deep in livestock feces, writing with the passion of a man composing symphonies. The true wealth of a nation, he essentially believed, is in its soil. And in his mind, the road to liberty was paved with really good cow poop. He also talked to himself, loudly, frequently, sometimes mid-debate, sometimes while walking in circles around his house like a caffeinated philosopher. To Adams, his own internal monologue was apparently too brilliant to keep inside, so out it came, like an 18th century podcast with exactly one subscriber. If he wasn't talking to himself, he was writing to someone else. Adams was addicted to letter writing the way modern people are addicted to doom scrolling. He once cranked out 113 letters in a single month. And these weren't, "Hey, how are you?" notes. These were deep dives into politics, morality, health complaints, the existential crises of early America. He wrote like the Postal Service was going to declare independence from him if he didn't calm down. The most enduring of these correspondences was with his wife, Abigail Adams. Their letters are some of the most intimate and revealing in American history, offering glimpses into everything from governance to gossip. And Adams loved gossip. He would relay rumors with gleeful precision, not just about political enemies, but about friends, neighbors, and anyone foolish enough to exist within earshot. He dished tea before it was cool if tea meant handwritten character assassinations of Thomas Jefferson. Now, Adams was a hypochondriac of Olympic skill. He cataloged his bodily functions with the fervor of a man who thought his own mortality was plotting against him. Every ache, every wheeze, every off-color stool was evidence of imminent death. He drank hard cider every morning, not because he enjoyed it, but because he believed it kick-started his body's inner constitution. He believed in early rising like, really early end, sometimes counted how many people respected him each day, like an insecure algorithm desperately checking its likes. Adams once described himself, in his own words, as obnoxious and disliked. Not exactly the branding slogan you want from a guy trying to found a nation, but the man was nothing if not brutally honest. He didn't believe in sugarcoating not his personality, not politics, and certainly not his medical beliefs. He thought chewing raw onions could cure a cold. He thought smiling in portraits looked undignified. He hated beards, but he loved owls. The man was a contradiction wrapped in a waistcoat. He had a feisty relationship with Benjamin Franklin, whom he considered too indulgent, too French, and too lazy. Adams once said Franklin shone from borrowed feathers, which is 18th century for that guy steals credit like it's his job. His jealousy extended to George Washington, too. Adams once lamented how Washington was treated like a demigod, while he himself was treated like a mongrel dog. This from the man who literally helped birth the Republic. And then there was his fear of death. It never left him. In fact, as he aged, Adams became increasingly philosophical about his own demise. He thought a lot about legacy, about how he'd be remembered, or if he'd be remembered at all. His obsession with mortality wasn't just a fear, it was a guiding principle. It shaped his policies, his writings, his need to document every moment of his existence. But there's a dark irony that hangs over Adams' life like an unsent letter. On July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence, John Adams died. His last words? "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was wrong. Jefferson had died just a few hours earlier. Two founding titans dying on the same day, in eerie synchronicity. It's the kind of twist you couldn't write without getting accused of historical fan fiction. Adams' life was filled with layers: public achievements, private eccentricities, bursts of philosophical clarity followed by spirals of anxiety and pettiness. But what made him bizarre wasn't that he talked to birds, or counted how many people respected him, or believed in raw onion cures. It's that he did all of it while helping create the foundation of a country. And just as Adams faded from life, leaving behind his books, his compost theories, and his epistolary empire, a very different kind of eccentric was waiting in the wings. A man who believed mammoths roamed the West, who built swivel chairs and rewrote the Bible, and who would prove that weirdness wasn't just a presidential bug, it was a feature. He was Thomas Jefferson, and he was about to make John Adams look positively normal. Thomas Jefferson. If John Adams was the neurotic diary writer of the American Revolution, then Thomas Jefferson was its elegantly unhinged philosopher-king, a man who embodied Enlightenment ideals with the intensity of a man trying to win an argument with the universe itself. He didn't just dabble in science, art, agriculture, and philosophy, inhaled them, digested them, and then built Monticello on the regurgitated remains. Thomas Jefferson was weird, brilliant, foundational, yes but deeply, cerebrally, gourmet, weird. Let's start with his macaroni. Jefferson was so enamored with pasta that he brought a pasta machine back from Europe and served mac and cheese at formal White House dinners. That's right. While George Washington was dodging bullets and John Adams was diagnosing himself with 17 different plagues, Jefferson was over here revolutionizing American cuisine with elbow noodles and imported Parmesan at a state dinner, with ambassadors. And then there was Dick. No, not a scandal, his pet mockingbird. Jefferson adored the bird, let it perch on his shoulder, let it sing to him while he worked. This wasn't just an eccentric hobby. Jefferson kept a literal soundtrack to his Enlightenment labor, and it chirped. But beneath the music and macaroni lay a mind that refused to sleep. Literally. Jefferson often stayed up until 2 a.m., reading by candlelight, scribbling in his notebooks, redesigning architecture, or editing drafts of letters with a copying device he invented himself. That device? The polygraph. Not for detecting lies, but for duplicating documents. In a poetic twist, the founding father, most obsessed with truth, never trusted it to a single copy. He was a compulsive note-taker, logging everything. The weather, market prices, daily habits, his emotional temperature. This wasn't journalage, it was surveillance of himself. He carried a thermometer and barometer everywhere, recording temperature variations like he was trying to win a bet with God. His Monticello mansion included a mechanical rotating closet between rooms. Why? Because walking around is for people without enlightenment to contemplate. He was a prolific inventor, an amateur architect, and a full-time dreamer who once had a full-grown moose shipped to Paris. Why? Because a French scientist claimed European animals were larger and more evolved than American ones. Jefferson responded not with a letter, but with a dead, stuffed moose. It's probably the most passive-aggressive scientific rebuttal in taxidermy history. And if you think that's the peak of odd behavior, hold your powdered wigs. Jefferson rewrote the Bible, not metaphorically, physically. He took a razor to the New Testament, sliced out every miracle and divine reference, and glued the remainder into what he called the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth. It was Jesus, but make it Enlightenment approved. Less walk on water, more walk to virtue. Despite his fame for writing that all men are created equal, Jefferson also had pet grizzly bear cubs. They were a gift from explorer Zebulon Pike. Most people would say thank you and quietly re-gift. Jefferson let them roam the White House lawn, which, to be fair, probably solved a lot of budget debates very quickly. He had a weird obsession with clocks. Monticello was filled with them, some so elaborate their weights dangled through the floor into the cellar. He kept such precise track of time that he even adjusted his personal calendar, designing his own system for holidays and dates, because of course he did. Ordinary time wasn't good enough for the man who wanted to reinvent America. He had to reinvent Tuesday too. And the wine. Jefferson didn't just drink imported 20 bottles of it. He built an entire wine cellar to support what was essentially an Enlightenment-era sommelier addiction. And while other politicians might have campaigned on a hard cider platform, Jefferson would have campaigned on a Bordeaux terroir. But perhaps the most curious contradiction in Jefferson's life was his approach to communication. Though he hated public speaking and mumbled during his rare appearances, he wrote over 19 letters in his lifetime. That's not a typo. 19,000. He wrote letters like some people breathe constantly, automatically, and often to avoid awkward silence. He believed in secrecy to an almost obsessive degree. He used invisible ink and ciphers for his most sensitive correspondence. He avoided confrontation like it was smallpox, often resorting to exquisitely passive-aggressive letters to settle disputes. And when it came to Congress, he straight up ghosted the place. After his inauguration, he never addressed Congress in person again. Instead, he sent them written messages. That's right, Thomas Jefferson invented the presidential email. Despite claiming to be a vegetarian, Jefferson wrote glowingly about ham and venison. He also had a cold foot bath routine that he swore warded off illness. Every morning, regardless of season, he'd soak his feet in cold water, believing it kept his immune system sharp. It was the kind of quirky wellness routine you'd expect from a modern influencer, not the author of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson also had deep convictions about architecture, aesthetics, and the soul of a republic. He designed Monticello to reflect Enlightenment ideals, but his experimental roofing leaked constantly. In other words, his house was like his philosopha brilliant, in theory, occasionally soggy in practice. By the end of his life, Jefferson was still dreaming, still tinkering, still revising the past and hypothesizing the future. And on July 4, 1826, the same day as John Adamshe died, two founding fathers expired on the 50th anniversary of the country they helped create. History doesn't write endings that poetic, except when it does. But Jefferson's death didn't close the door on presidential oddity, it blew it wide open. Because waiting in the wings was a man the size of a middle schooler, with the anxiety of a modern-day Reddit user and the public speaking skills of a collapsing souffle. James Madison. James Madison was barely 5'4" and weighed in at a fragile 100 pounds soaking wet. He was small, soft-spoken, and physically unimposing, a founding father who looked more like a background character in a colonial school play. But this miniature man drafted the Bill of Rights, shaped the Constitution, and outlived most of the other founding giants by decades. And along the way, he amassed a portfolio of quirks so peculiar that even Jefferson, his Enlightenment-obsessed, grizzly bear-owning BFF, might have raised an eyebrow. Let's start with the voice. Madison's voice was so faint, so whispery, that even in packed halls, people leaned forward like they were trying to catch the final riddle from a dying wizard. In one particularly humiliating instance, he fainted during a speech in Congress, just dropped to the floor mid-sentence. Public speaking was, as they say, not his strong suit. Madison's social presence matched his voice. Minimal, awkward, and prone to glitching under pressure. He was a champion mumbler, often rubbing his hands together during arguments in what became his nervous tic. Dinner guests described him as standoffish, even with family. And if you tried to pet his dog, you couldn't, because he didn't have one. He found barking disruptive to his concentration and preferred his home pet-free. Silence was sacred. He hated being touched, hated mirrors, hated red clothing, too blazing and uncivilized, and hated being seen smiling. In fact, he once refused to be painted with a grin because he thought it made him look unserious, and he was dead serious about not being unserious. Madison was also an obsessive weather watcher. He didn't just track weather, he documented it with near-religious precision. Temperature, wind speed, rainfall, he logged it all, like a man trying to catch nature in a lie. He believed wind direction could influence mental clarity, and reportedly paused conversations to note changes in the breeze. The guy was basically the colonial-era version of a Weather Channel addict with a theology degree. He also believed emotions could be managed through diet. Angry foods, like red meat and garlic, were avoided in favor of bread and vegetables. In his younger days, he was even a proto-vegetarian, surviving on a diet that would make a monk nod approvingly. This wasn't about health trends, it was about moral calibration. Madison believed what you ate shaped who you were. He treated his stomach like a moral compass. He also had terrible handwriting, not quirky, charming bad, more like cryptic, jagged snake on a page bad. Historians have described it as nearly impossible to decipher, even with magnifying glasses and a lot of caffeine. This man drafted constitutional amendments in a script that looked like a spider died on the page. Madison feared cold like it owed him money. He would bundle up in absurd layer 7 in mild weather, wool stockings in summer, blankets in rooms that didn't need them. He practically dressed like he was planning to survive a siege, not host a dinner. And oh, the obsessions. Madison practiced his penmanship well into his 70s, convinced that neat writing reflected moral clarity. He carried snuff in a gold box, feared thunderstorms to the point of hiding during loud ones, and kept invisible ink around just in case. For what? Who knows? Maybe to secretly annotate the Constitution with ghost notes. Then there were the health anxieties. Madison was a hypochondriac to rival John Adams. He often feared he was about to die. Not in a dramatic way, just in a quietly obsessive, pulse-checking, symptom-tracking spiral. He once sat for hours, monitoring his heartbeat, convinced it was skipping beats. He never fully shook the feeling that his own body was betraying him. Despite all that, he married Dolly Madison, one of the most outgoing, social, and fashionable first ladies in American history. How did that happen? No one knows. But while James hid from thunder, Dolly threw legendary parties. While he tracked wind direction, she was setting social trends in Washington. Together, they were the prototype of opposites attract. In one of history's darker punchlines, Madison, the fragile, nervous, eternally bundled man, ended up living longer than almost all of his peers. He died at 85, decades after Washington, Jefferson, and Adams had returned to the dust. His body may have been brittle, but his constitution, both personal and political, was built to last. But Madison's brand of weird was intellectual, obsessive, almost monastic. Coming next is a very different flavor of presidential oddity. A man who carried a Revolutionary War bullet in his body, named his trees, and wore silk gloves indoors. A man whose soul was stuck somewhere between 1776 and a thunderstorm. James Monroe is next, and he's about to make Enlightenment weirdness look positively civilized. James Monroe. James Monroe looked like a founding father who had walked off a battlefield and straight into a formal dinner, still dusty, still bleeding patriotism. and still somehow wearing a powdered wig decades after the rest of the country moved on. He was the last of the old guard, a Revolutionary War veteran turned president, and he wore that identity like a moth-eaten uniform he refused to throw away. And yet, beneath the faded glory and stoic portraits, James Monroe was quietly, delightfully bizarre. To begin, let's talk about fashion or the lack thereof. Monroe clung to outdated clothing styles like they were sacred texts. While his successors embraced the tailored look of the 19th century, Monroe still looked like a man prepping for a duel with King George. Silk cravats, knee breeches, and yes, powdered wigs. It was like he was cosplaying the American Revolution at all times. But it wasn't nostalgia, it was Monroe's personal style, set in sartorial stone. He also kept a literal war souvenir inside him, a bullet embedded in his shoulder from the Revolutionary War. It stayed with him his entire life. No removal, no complaint. Just a quiet internal reminder that freedom isn't free and that sometimes medical technology is 50 years behind the guy bleeding on the operating table. Monroe hated banks, hated them like a man who thought interest rates were a tool of Satan. He didn't trust paper money either, preferred coins and, when possible, straight-up bartering. One anecdote even suggests he once mended his own coat rather than pay a tailor. That's not frugality, that's survivalist couture. He walked everywhere, long distances, in bad weather, uphill, both ways, kind of vibes. He was offered carriages, declined them, preferred walking, even as an aging president. It wasn't exercise, it was control. Monroe believed in discipline, and every step was a victory march over indulgence. It's no wonder he once counted stairs aloud while climbing them, claiming it gave him clarity. And when things weren't clear, he asked busts of ancient philosophers. He would sit alone and speak to them. Socrates, Cicero, whoever was Neresto, seek wisdom. Some men consult advisors. Monroe consulted marbled chins. If there's a more poetic image of presidential solitude, it hasn't been carved yet. He believed dreams carried practical meaning, not spiritual guidance, not omens practical instructions. So he sometimes slept in his study, believing the environment helped channel thoughts. It's the kind of logic that would make a psychologist blink and a poet nod approvingly. Monroe had superstitions that bordered on ritual. He wore silk gloves indoors, even during summer. He kept mirrors to a minimum and often hid in his cellar during thunderstorms. He once called thunder the drum roll of heaven, and he truly believed that reading at night by candlelight could overheat the mind. Not the eyes, the mind. The man counted steps, refused to eat in front of strangers, named the trees on his property. That's not charming eccentricity. That's a personality built on the emotional scaffolding of a haunted diary. Speaking of trees, he taught his grandchildren to salute ancient ones, as in, walk outside, find an old tree, salute it. This was part reverence, part ritual, and part deeply American folklore. Monroe saw symbolism in everything. He marked his books with turkey feathers because he believed it helped memory. He called rain the sky's conscience. He banned the word nice from his household, calling it a dead word. Monroe didn't just live history, he poeticized it in real time. And the clock thing. He set all his clocks 10 minutes fast, not for punctuality, for philosophy. He believed time was always slipping away, and the clocks were a way to stay ahead of fate. He also grew his fingernails slightly long and filed them into subtle points. Not enough to raise eyebrows, but enough to make you say, "Wait, did you see that?" His habits were intensely personal. He tied receipts into bundles by year and hid them in secret drawers. He grew his own vinegar. He chewed licorice root during cabinet meetings to calm his nerves. He once made shadow puppets to relax. He refused to whistle indoors because he believed it invited mischief. And yes, he invented names for constellations in his personal star journal. James Monroe wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He wasn't revolutionary in the public sense. But he was quietly, methodically bizarre. He lived like a man who thought the Enlightenment had unfinished business with his soul. And in many ways it did. He died on July 4, 1831, making him the third president in a row to die on Independence Day. If history were a novelist, we'd accuse it of overdoing the symbolism. But Monroe's death ushered in a new kind of strangeness, less philosophical, more theatrical. Because coming up next was a president who talked to birds, swam naked in the Potomac, and kept an alligator in the White House bathroom. John Quincy Adams didn't just inherit the presidency from his father. He inherited the weird and made it his own. John Quincy Adams. If ever there was a president who treated the office like a personal thought experiment in eccentricity, it was John Quincy Adams. The son of John Adams, he inherited his father's brilliance and insecurity, but cranked the oddity dial until it snapped off in his hand. Where James Monroe wandered his property talking to ancient trees, John Quincy took it several steps further, naked, barefoot, and arguing with God, birds, and his own moral compass. Let's dive right into the Potomac River. Literally. John Quincy Adams swam in it nearly every morning completely naked. This wasn't a one-time stunt or some rustic nod to nature. It was routine. Rain or shine, President Adams would disrobe, march into the river like it was his private baptismal font, and take his morning dip. His critics were appalled, his supporters were confused. But Adams didn't care. The man believed cold water immersion cleared the mind. Maybe it did. Maybe it just confirmed what everyone already suspected. And then there was the alligator. Yes, an actual alligator. The Marquis de Lafayette gifted it to him, because nothing says Franco-American friendship like a reptilian predator. Rather than rehome the creature or, scream, Adams kept it in a White House bathroom. He thought it was amusing. He thought it kept guests on their toes. He might have been right. Imagine visiting the president and being told to avoid the East Lavatory because of the lurking swamp beast. That's not a security risk. That's a statement. But Adams' real wildness lived in his head and in his diary. He kept one for over 60 years, filling more than 15 pages with daily entries, weather updates, political musings, omens seen in dreams, self-assigned grades on his behavior. That's right, Adams graded himself. A lifelong student, he treated each day like a moral exam. B+ for honesty, C for humility, needs work on tact. He believed in daily judgment, and he was the jury, judge, and executioner. He also believed animals had moral compasses. He once claimed to have had an entire conversation with a bird. Not just talking to Ive believed it responded. Adams didn't anthropomorphize animals. He theologized them. He thought birds sang hymns. He thought pets revealed character. At one point, he gave letter grades not only to himself, but to his plants and birds. This was a man who believed the White House garden was part classroom, part confessional. Adams was intensely physical in his eccentricities. He walked over 5 miles a day, often talking to himself the entire time. Sometimes he'd walk backwards up hills for balance. He believed that walking barefoot on wet grass improved his eyesight. He believed in daily cold water baths, fasting for spiritual calibration, and refusing warm clothing in winter because suffering built character. He wasn't training for office. He was training for sainthood. He refused to dance, scowled at gambling, and once declined a royal banquet because he found the centerpiece immoral. He practiced fencing into his 60s, trained himself to read upside down, and wrote in Latin, Greek, French, and English, sometimes all in the same sentence. He was an intellectual blender. Most people read novels to unwind. Adams believed novels weakened moral fiber. For relaxation, He recited memorized Bible passages and composed poetry about national virtue. His lectures were legendary for all the wrong reasons. Strangers cursed in his presence. He'd pull them aside for a morality lecture. Once, he was overheard lecturing a guest about cursing while simultaneously identifying a bird species by song. He believed the moon influenced human behavior, that dreams could signal forgotten obligations, and that fire in dreams meant impending guilt. He once cataloged a single apple he ate in an entry titled Moral Texture. Adams also had a strange relationship with silence. He believed meals should be quiet, that joy should be internalized, and that smiling in portraits was undignified. He once told a photographer to erase any hint of mirth. He viewed joy as a private matter. Celebration? That was for children. Reflection, on the other hand, was an all-day activity. And when he wasn't reflecting, he was fighting. Adams didn't retire quietly after his presidency. No, he returned to Congress and became a firebrand advocate against slavery, against the annexation of Texas, and in favor of intellectual debate. He argued cases before the Supreme Court, most famously defending the captives of the Amistad in a passionate stand for human rights. He didn't slow down, he sharpened. He outworked colleagues half his age. He died literally on the House floor, suffering a stroke at his desk, mid-session. A fitting end for a man who viewed public service as a sacred, lifelong ordeal. John Quincy Adams wasn't flashy. He didn't inspire cults of personality. But his life was an uninterrupted stream of strangeness, braided with brilliance. He lived like a monk on loan to the state, swimming naked by morning, debating Congress by day, and grating his soul by candlelight each night. And if you thought that was strange, well, you haven't met the man who followed him. A war hero, with a chip on his shoulder, a dueling pistol in his hand, and a parrot that had to be kicked out of his funeral for swearing too much. Andrew Jackson is next. And the weirdness? It's about to go loud. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson didn't just walk into the White House. He kicked the door down, planted his muddy boots on the table, and dared the furniture to say something about it. He was the first president to be born in a log cabin, the first to survive an assassination attempt, and the first to leave behind a trail of dueling opponents, chewed tobacco stains, and fist-pounded policy proclamations so aggressive they might as well have come with their own soundtrack of cannon fire. Jackson was a one-man rebellion with a presidential seal. He began his political rise the same way he began most things: angry, wounded, and wildly confrontational. At 13, Jackson fought in the Revolutionary War, was captured by the British, and when ordered to shine an officer's boots, he refused. The officer slashed Jackson's face with a sword. The scar stayed with him for life on his face and in his personality. It wasn't just a mark, it was a prophecy. Jackson grew up with a vendetta against authority and a thirst for personal justice. That sense of personal justice led him to participate in more than 100 duels. One of those duels involved a man who insulted Jackson's wife. Jackson let his opponent fire first and take a bullet straight to his chest. Then Jackson calmly raised his own pistol and shot the man dead. The bullet? It stayed in his chest for the rest of his life, lodged beside another one from an earlier duel. The man was less a president, more a mobile iron filing cabinet of grievances. And then there was the parrot. Jackson's beloved pet parrot, Pole, reportedly had to be removed from Jackson's funeral because it wouldn't stop cursing. And not just cursing obscenities so graphic that mourners blushed and ministers gawked. Jackson taught it himself, which makes sense. This is the same president whose staff created code words to replace his habitual swearing in official transcripts. Imagine running a cabinet meeting while chewing tobacco and shouting epithets that needed to be redacted like CIA files. He never trusted banks, not metaphorically, literally. He thought they were evil, corrupt institutions designed to steal from the people. He vetoed the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States, survived a Senate censure, and carried out a policy so radical it eventually tanked the economy. But Jackson didn't care. He thought paper money was a scam and preferred gold coins he could bite for authenticity. He sometimes kept money hidden in jars around his property. The man basically ran the U.S. economy, like a pioneer hoarding apocalypse gold. He was also the only president to completely pay off the national debt. For a brief shining moment in the 1830s, the United States owed $0. It didn't last, but neither did Jackson's patience for compromise. He once threatened to invade South Carolina, a U.S. state, if it continued pushing nullification. Jackson's idea of federal unity was less "we the people" and more "you better fall in line, or I'll personally march down there and settle this with my cane." Speaking of which, that cane. Jackson carried it everywhere, not for walking, but for intimidation. After surviving an assassination attempt, in which both of the assassin's pistols misfired at point-blank range, Jackson leapt at the man and beat him with the cane until bystanders dragged him off. He was in his 60s at the time, possibly bleeding internally, possibly laughing. He slept with a loaded pistol by his bed. He chewed tobacco constantly and spat it on White House floors during meetings. He referred to Congress as a bunch of crows pecking at a corpse. He named his horse Sam Patch after a daredevil who jumped waterfalls, and he once burned letters from political enemies without reading them. His entire presidency was fueled by a mixture of frontier justice, old-school vengeance, and a political philosophy that sounded a lot like yelling. Jackson also believed in omens. He consulted a personal astrologer in secret. He thought owls were unlucky and once fired a shotgun at one outside his window. He talked to paintings of his wife and military heroes. He carved insults into trees to annoy neighbors. He referred to his fireplace as the only honest thing in Washington. And yet, amid all the chaos, Jackson had a strange kind of loyalty. He wore a locket containing a piece of his deceased wife's hair until he died. He let his dogs sleep in his bed. He named furniture. He believed in omens, but also in fate. He never once apologized for anything publicly. He saw remorse as weakness. He believed, until the very end, that he had done God's work. History still isn't sure. Jackson wasn't just a populist president. He was a force of nature, a thunderstorm in a suit. And when he left office, he didn't so much pass the torch as light it on fire and hurl it backward over his shoulder. But what came next was stranger still, a man known as the Little Magician. A sharp-dressed New Yorker with a love for peppermint candy, lavender gloves, and dinner parties where everything was orange. Martin Van Buren is next, and the weirdness is about to get fancy. Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren was the first American president born after the United States became an independent nation, and he spent most of his life trying to look like he'd invented the idea of being American. Sharp-dressed, smooth-talking, and short, just 5'6", Van Buren was nicknamed the Little Magician for his political maneuvering. But behind the polished exterior was a man of cultivated strangeness. A dandy with a penchant for lavender-scented gloves, an obsession with hair grooming, and enough odd superstitions to fill a haunted opera house. Let's begin with his aesthetic obsessions. Van Buren took fashion personally. He wore extra-tight trousers, always made sure his coat matched the mood of the event, and spent nearly an hour each day styling his sideburns. The result? Facial hair so iconic it bordered on satire. It was his trademark, his brand, his mustache-free facial fur statement to the world: I am dignified, I am deliberate, and yes, I am fabulous. He was also violently opposed to casual language. He hated the word ain't, referring to it as a linguistic crime. He spoke with a high-pitched, nasal voice that made his formal diction sound even more like an angry school teacher scolding the American public. If you were lucky enough to be invited to one of his legendary themed dinners, you'd find everything color-coordinated. One time, he hosted a banquet where the food, flowers, decorations, and even the clothing were all varying shades of orange. No explanation, just orange. Despite being a lifelong teetotaler, Van Buren loved throwing parties. He hosted lavish balls and state dinners filled with wine, opera music, and more food than most guests could identify. His dry sobriety made him a rare figure in an era where politicians often drank like fish, but it didn't stop him from indulging in opulence. If anything, he weaponized it. Think Gatsby without the bootleg gin. He once received a stuffed armadillo as a gift and proudly displayed it in the White House. To Van Buren, it was probably another fashionable centerpiece. But his quirks didn't stop at the decor. He carried peppermint candies in his coat and offered them to visitors. He refused to use silver knives, believing they cut with arrogance, and preferred bone-handled utensils. He wore lavender-scented gloves, avoided all red clothing too emotionally unstable, he said, and gave thank-you notes to trees. Yes, actual trees. He once sent a letter to a maple, describing its dignified stance against the sky. This wasn't irony. This was serious botanical diplomacy. Van Buren also refused to be called Marty. When a guest tried it once, they were politely but firmly escorted out. He believed names held power. He believed clocks did too, though he only kept them in certain rooms, citing the pressure of visible time. He called umbrellas sky shields, believed in cosmic approval via sneezing, and thought tomatoes caused indigestion if eaten after sunset. He had a fear of falling down stairs, always held both railings, every time. He also had a custom-made toothpick case shaped like a miniature carriage. He wrote poetry about buttons. Believed beards were signs of emotional instability. And yes, he believed that dreams predicted political outcome, especially recurring ones involving water. His bedtime routine bordered on ritualistic. He slept with a specially curved reading couch and tracked his dreams in a journal. When he woke up, he logged his mood, checked the weather, and polished his shoes with rose water. That's not getting ready for the day, that's preparing for a performance. His life was orchestrated like a public opera, and he never missed a note. Politically, Van Buren was a master strategist. He organized the Democratic Party into a formidable machine and helped secure Jackson's presidency before stepping into the role himself. But while Jackson wielded power like a battle axe, Van Buren finessed it like a fencer with a monogrammed rapier. His presidency, however, was plagued by the Panic of 1837, a massive financial crisis that tanked the economy. Van Buren responded with his usual calm, deliberate flair and a complete refusal to use banks. Despite the financial disaster, Van Buren remained composed, dignified, and delightfully peculiar. He collected over 200 walking sticks, most of which he never used. He named his bed the Parliament of Rest. He believed grapes were royal fruit and only ate them on Sundays. He disliked music, refused to whistle, and trained himself not to answer yes or no questions because truth resides in the gray. Van Buren didn't just want to be remembered. He wanted to be remembered as a stylist, a tactician, a man who moved history with elegance and spoke to trees because someone had to. And even though he lost re-election and drifted from the national spotlight, he never stopped being fascinating. He died believing that history would recall his grace, not his economic failures. But just as his rose-scented gloves faded from the scene, America swung in the opposite direction into the hands of a war-hardened, rough-hewn general who refused to wear a coat, rode horses side saddle for fun, and delivered the longest inauguration speech in presidential history in freezing rain. William Henry Harrison is next, and he won't be around long, but oh, will he make an entrance. William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison is best known for two things: giving the longest inauguration speech in U.S. history and dying almost immediately afterward. But before he became the tragic punchline of presidential tenure, he managed to cram a lifetime's worth of quirks, odd habits, and frontier-fueled eccentricities into his short, chilly time in the spotlight. Let's begin with that speech. On March 4, 1841, Harrison stood in freezing rain for nearly 2 hours, delivering a 90-minute inaugural address without a coat or hat. Why? To prove he was tough. To show he was still the war hero of Tippecanoe, not some fragile old man. He was 68, the oldest president elected at the time. His political enemies said he was frail. So he went full weather doesn't scare me mode. 10 days later, he had a cough. 31 days after taking office, he was dead. That's 1 day in the Oval Office for every 2.9 minutes of his speech. The math is brutal. The irony is Shakespearean. But long before that icy mic drop, Harrison was already marching to his own strange drum. He studied medicine in his youth but dropped out because he couldn't handle the sight of blood. He went on to become a war general. That's like quitting culinary school because you hate knives and becoming a butcher instead. He hated forks, called them unmanly prongs, ate with his hands like some kind of frontier aristocrat. And when he did sit down to eat, he sometimes did it with a goat named Whiskers, who lived with him at frontier forts. That's not a metaphor. The man had a literal pet goat. He slept fully clothed even in his boots. He regularly chewed tree bark for digestion. He refused to use mirrors at night, calling them reflectors of ill dreams. He believed shaving too often weakened the soul. That's not hygiene, that's mysticism wrapped in leather boots. His home life was full of these quirks. He covered mirrors with cloth. He never owned a clock, claimed. Time should be felt, not seen. He once tried to train a raccoon to live indoors. Named it Judge Grumble. The experiment ended badly. He also believed thunder was God shouting at fools, that rain was the sky's conscience, and that biting lemons before speeches gave him clarity. He wrote dreams down in elaborate journals and tried to decode them like celestial crossword puzzles. And despite his grizzled battlefield image, he wrote awkward poems for friends, referred to his horse as Conscience on hooves, and smoked corncob pipes backward in purpose to confuse misfortune. His presidency may have lasted just 31 days, but his legend lingers because he arrived with so much performative bravado and left with such tragic speed. He turned the weather into a political statement, and the weather won. But Harrison's ghostly sprint through the Oval Office would lead directly to a man who took over unexpectedly, held mock trials for his pets, and gave each of his children their own assigned day to speak at dinner. John Tyler is next, and he's got enough bizarre habits to fill the entire vice presidency and then some. John Tyler. John Tyler was never supposed to be president. He was the vice president who inherited the office when William Henry Harrison famously expired after just 31 days. Many in Washington didn't even want to recognize him as the real president, calling him His Accidency, a nickname that stuck harder than any campaign slogan. But Tyler leaned into the title, settled into the role, and governed with the kind of unexpected weirdness that made him feel more like the eccentric uncle of the presidency than its accidental steward. Start with the most headline-worthy fact. John Tyler had 15 children. That's more than any other U.S. president. His youngest child was born when Tyler was in his 70s. The math alone is exhausting. Even more astounding, 2 of his grandchildren were still alive well into the 20th century. That's not a generational riplights, a time-bending shockwave. But Tyler's household wasn't just large, it was structured like a satirical play. He reportedly assigned each of his children a specific day of the week they were allowed to speak during dinner. Imagine being a child in the Tyler home, holding on to a juicy thought for 6 days because your assigned speech day was Thursday. He was deeply superstitious and wildly particular. He refused to shake hands on Thursday, called it a cursed day for contact. He wouldn't eat food cut with silver knives, insisting on bone-handled ones instead. And if someone brought up cats, he'd leave the room. He had an irrational fear of them and treated feline proximity like an active threat. Tyler also held mock trials for his pets. He'd create entire legal dramas, complete with charges, verdicts, and sentencing. His children were sometimes the jury. The pets, usually guilty. Justice in the Tyler household was swift, weird, and possibly handed down in rhyme since he once trained one of his sons to speak only in verse for poetic discipline. He believed that drinking cold water at sunset prevented nightmares. He sprinkled salt in his shoes for moral grounding. He called his bed the thinking theater and claimed to dream better while wearing boots. He had a mirror inscribed with poetry and read it aloud to himself every morning, presumably before arguing with furniture, some of which he named and spoke to, especially his writing desk. He didn't trust modern inventions. Rejected the telegraph as a toy for impatient minds. Refused to eat with more than 6 people at a time, said larger meals created intellectual chaos. He wouldn't write letters in black ink, using only green for freshness of thought. And he didn't just leave office. He left the country ideologically, at least. During the Civil War, Tyler sided with the Confederacy. He was elected to the Confederate Congress, and when he died, he was buried under a Confederate flag, making him the only U.S. president laid to rest under a foreign banner. The federal government didn't even acknowledge his death. No flags at half-mast, no ceremony, just a historical footnote wrapped in rebellion. John Tyler might have started as an accidental president, but he ended as one of the most bizarre figures to ever wear the title. And his departure paved the way for a man who once had surgery without anesthesia, kept a detailed notebook of his dreams, and refused to be photographed smiling because he thought it was unmanly cheer. James K. Polk is next. And he's bringing the obsessive energy of a man who thought coughs needed to be documented like military orders. James K. Polk. James K. Polk was a man on a Mashona, silent, grimly determined mission to overachieve and underenjoy every single second of his presidency. He is one of the few U.S. presidents who actually did exactly what he promised. He set 4 goals when he took office, achieved all 4, and then walked away after one term like a guy checking off chores on a cosmic to-do list. But behind that disciplined facade was a man so intensely rigid, superstitious, and habit-locked that his entire presidency feels less like a campaign and more like a very strange endurance ritual. First off, the surgery. At just 17, Polk underwent an operation to remove urinary stones without anesthesia. He was fully conscious. No ether, no chloroform. Just a few guys holding him down and a doctor with a knife. It was the 1820s equivalent of taking a chainsaw to a hornet's nest while giving a TED Talk. Somehow, he survived. But the trauma shaped him. He would go on to distrust doctors, self-prescribe herbal tinctures, and monitor his body like a man expecting it to betray him at any moment. He was sickly for most of his life and obsessed with health. Not the kind of health that leads to kale smoothies, but the kind that made him keep a notebook logging every cough, fever, and sneeze. He believed dreams carried messages from divine forces, and he kept a dream journal as meticulous as his legislative agenda. He also refused to eat food prepared by strangers, especially while campaigning. He feared contamination, even sabotage. If it wasn't made by his inner circle, he wasn't touching it. That same distrust extended to shaking hand. She thought it spread illness, and often wore gloves while meeting the public. Polk didn't drink alcohol, didn't dance, and banned cards and dice games from the White House. His inaugural ball, the only one in American history without dancing. Imagine walking into a presidential party and discovering it's essentially a very well-dressed staff meeting. That was Polk's idea of a good time. He hated music. Once called a violin a screaming stick. He disliked smiling in portraits, thought it looked unserious. He wore the same coat and tie every day. His handwriting was almost violently precise, and he frequently repeated sentences out loud before speaking them, to ensure verbal accuracy. He believed flowers altered moods and could invite spirits, so he kept them out of his study. He kept a miniature Bible in his coat pocket and touched it before meetings. He believed owls were reincarnated prophets. He banned umbrellas because rain was a blessing not to be dodged. He polished his shoes at sunset, never sunrise. He even trained himself to blink less during confrontations, believing it made him look more dominant. Who does that? His desk had a name, the Silent Senator. His favorite pen was made from a raven's quill. He thought smiling at dogs invited bad weather, and he never took vacations, not even once. He worked every day of his presidency and died just 103 days after leaving office, likely from exhaustion. He gave the country Texas, California, the Oregon Territory, and, in return, the country gave him a slow death and a sleepy historical reputation. Polk was not beloved. He was respected, feared, sometimes admired. But warm? No. He treated the presidency like a contract with fate. Serve one term, expand the nation, burn out. And if Polk was all cold control and rigid rule-following, the man who followed him was the exact opposite: mud-covered, tobacco-chewing, boot-wearing general who ate pickles for breakfast and once died, possibly, from a bucket of cherries. Zachary Taylor is next, and the White House is about to get very unsanitary. Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor, known affectionately and somewhat menacingly as Old Rough and Ready, looked like a man who'd been pulled straight from the muddy edge of a battlefield and accidentally installed in the White House. A lifelong military general with absolutely zero political experience, Taylor stumbled into the presidency like someone mistook a war hero for a statesman and then just never corrected the error. Let's start with his voting record. He never voted in a presidential election. Not once. Not even in the one he won. This wasn't some lofty abstention on principle, he just didn't see the point. Voting, to Taylor, was apparently something for civilians. He viewed politics the same way he viewed napkins: unnecessary, overly formal, and probably hiding something weak underneath. His approach to fashion was non-existent. Even as a general, Taylor preferred to wear farmers' clothes instead of military uniforms. Loose trousers, dusty shirts, and a complete disregard for anything resembling a tailored look. When he entered the White House, he didn't upgrade, he dragged the front porch with him. At state dinners, he sometimes showed up looking like he'd just finished building a barn, and sometimes he'd just leave mid-meal without explanation. He often slept outdoors, even when he was indoors. Taylor was known to set up a wooden cot and sleep outside if the weather allowed her. Occasionally, even if it didn't, he didn't trust modern bedding. He considered it too soft, too luxurious, too unearned. Bathing? Rare. He once claimed dirt was a natural shield against disease. He chewed raw tobacco constantly and spit directly into fireplaces, which created both a hazard and a smell that likely haunted the drapes forever. And once, during a meeting, his jacket caught on fire from the fireplace. He didn't notice, kept talking. He was loud, gruff, and completely uninterested in decorum. He didn't trust banks, kept his savings hidden in nails hammered into barn walls. He had terrible memory for names, even cabinet members. He called wine perfumed foolishness, hated umbrellas, and called neckties city nooses. At formal events, he would eat with his fingers when no one was looking, sometimes even when they were. But the oddest and perhaps most infamous chapter of Taylor's life came at the end. On a scorching July day in 1850, after attending a 4th of July event at the Washington Monument, he returned home and ate an entire bucket of cherries, then drank iced milk. Within days, he was dead. The official cause: cholera morbus, likely triggered by the fruit and dairy in the heat. Conspiracy theories swirled. He was exhumed decades later for testing. Verdict: not poisoned, just over-cherried. Zachary Taylor's presidency was short, unsophisticated, and brutally earthy. He didn't govern so much as survive the White House, and he never adapted to its expectations. He wore the same boots for over a decade, patched them until they were nearly transparent, and treated the Oval Office like an outpost in a war that never quite ended. But with Taylor gone, the country was left in the hands of a man who refused to hire a butler, read the entire dictionary for fun, and measured his bookshelves daily to make sure they hadn't shifted in the night. Millard Fillmore is next, and the age of owl-embroidered handkerchiefs and spiral anxiety letters has arrived. Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore is often remembered when he's remembered at Alice, the answer to a trivia question, or a presidential punchline. But behind the forgettable name and placeholder legacy was a man so obsessed with order, etiquette, and minutia that he makes your most fastidious friend look like a wild anarchist. Fillmore was less a president and more a human filing cabinet with sideburns. Let's start with his approach to the English language. Fillmore read the entire dictionary, cover to cover, for fun, not once, but multiple times throughout his life. He said it was to keep the mind agile, but let's be honest, it was probably also so he could silently judge the grammar of everyone around him. He didn't just love language, he viewed it as a kind of moral code. Misusing a semicolon in front of Fillmore might as well have been high treason. His obsession with tidiness bordered on clinical. He once fired a White House servant for folding napkins unevenly. He believed symmetry was a reflection of the soul and would rearrange furniture in rooms he was only visiting. He measured his bookshelves with a ruler every week to ensure none had tilted or warped. The man trusted literature but not gravity. Fillmore was also extremely frugal but in bizarrely selective ways. He installed the first bathtub in the White House, but refused to pay for warm water. Cold baths only. Said it was invigorating and a test of one's character. He wore the same pair of gloves for weeks and used scented handkerchiefs embroidered with owls, which he called his mood talismans. He didn't drink alcohol, didn't gamble, and avoided playing cards because he believed it tempted the idle hand. He once rejected a gift of chocolate, claiming it distracted the senses from productive thought. Fillmore wasn't about indulgence, he was about quiet, well-labeled discipline. Even his eating habits were strange. He ate precisely at 6:30 p.m. every night, regardless of schedule or company. Dinner began with a silent toast to the mechanism of civility. He ate bread with a fork and only consumed meat if he could verify the source farm's hygiene. He disliked dessert, but would occasionally allow himself a spoonful of plain custard described by one observer as melancholy pudding. He also refused to hire a personal butler, choosing instead to write detailed chore lists and distribute them personally to the staff. His handwriting was so neat it could have been typeset. He once rewrote an entire state dinner menu because the original used too many adjectives. Despite all this, Fillmore was a man of surprising cultural ambition. He founded the first permanent White House library and was a patron of obscure poets. He believed strongly in the power of architecture to shape the human mind and commissioned several redesigns of public spaces, always demanding they include corners of contemplation. And when not alphabetizing his books or policing punctuation, he had an odd fascination with weather. He kept a personal barometer journal, believed storms followed patterns of national unrest, and once refused to travel on a cloudy Tuesday, calling it an inauspicious hue. Millard Fillmore didn't lead with fire or flair. He governed with the precision of a man who probably ironed his shoelaces. But his tidy reign would soon give way to a leader who was as loud as Fillmore was quiet, as emotional as Fillmore was methodical, and who once publicly debated himself in the mirror just to hear a more agreeable voice. Franklin Pierce is next, And he's bringing the full melancholic chaos of a man who tried to outrun fate by drinking it under the table. Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce was handsome, charming, and emotionally unraveling like a man trying to hold a funeral inside a debutante ball. Dubbed Young Hickory of the Granite Hills, he had the bone structure of a movie star and the soul of a Gothic novel protagonist. His presidency was haunted literally and figuratively by death, alcohol, and a sense that history had cast him in a role he never auditioned for. Let's begin with the omen that defined his presidency before it even began. Just weeks before Pierce's inauguration, he and his wife, Jane, boarded a train with their son Benjamin. The train derailed. Everyone survived except for their 11-year-old son, who was decapitated in front of them. Jane, a devout and emotionally fragile woman, took this as a sign from God that Pierce's election was a punishment. She refused to attend his inauguration and spent much of his presidency in mourning clothes, writing letters to her dead son. Pierce himself, already struggling with inner darkness, sank deeper. Pierce was the only president to swear his oath of office on a law book instead of a Bible. He also chose to affirm rather than swear, citing his religious discomfort with oath-taking. The whole thing felt less like a victory lap, and more like a man reluctantly accepting a curse. He didn't just drink a drink like he was trying to put out a fire in his soul. Known for sneaking whiskey into water bottles, Pierce frequently drank alone, at odd hours, and often during work. His critics and colleagues alike noted his frequent slurring, his flushed complexion, and his tendency to wander off mid-conversation. Once, during a public appearance, he reportedly greeted the same person 3 times in 5 minutes. Pierce was obsessed with mirrors. Not for vanity, he hated being photographed and rarely smiled, but he would spend long minutes staring into mirrors, lost in thought, sometimes talking to himself. He believed they could reveal hidden truths, even fate. His staff reportedly covered mirrors in his room on bad days. He also had an intense, almost poetic fixation on silence. He hated ticking clocks, banned loud shoes in the White House, and once had a fireplace removed because he said it spoke too freely. He took long walks in the rain, whispering to himself, often ending the walk soaked and barefoot. It wasn't drama. It was therapy. Pierce kept a locked box filled with folded notes to himself, pep talks, self-critiques, and strange affirmations like, "You are not the fall," or "Silence is not defeat." He refused to use the phrase, "I'm sorry," preferring, "I was mistaken." He believed apologies weakened the presidency. Despite his personal demons, Pierce was extremely well-mannered. Too much so. He often refused to contradict people in public, even when they insulted him. He once allowed a man to berate him for 20 minutes at a dinner party, then thanked him for his honest passion. He also loved flowers, obsessed over them. His personal garden was arranged by color gradients, and he named each section after classical composers. He spoke to his roses in French. He believed lilacs were omens of peace, and once canceled a meeting because a bouquet felt unsettled. After leaving office, Pierce descended deeper into isolation and alcoholism. He spent hours reading tragic novels, scrawling notes in the margins like emotional autopsies. He lived alone, saw few visitors, and died of cirrhosis of the liver at age 64, remembered by some as the most handsome president and by others as the saddest. Franklin Pierce didn't lead so much as drift. He wasn't corrupted by power, he was crushed by it. And when he finally disappeared into the fog of history, the country turned its eyes to a man whose beard could out-debate most senators, who received letters addressed simply to the big guy in the White House, and who spoke with such a thick Pennsylvania Dutch accent that half the country thought he was inventing words. James Buchanan is next, and the weirdness is about to get both louder and lonelier. James Buchanan. James Buchanan was the only lifelong bachelor to ever occupy the White House, and he governed like a man who'd made an uneasy truce with solitude. He was formal to the point of fossilization, prided himself on etiquette, and lived in a self-imposed echo chamber of white gloves, letters, and carefully folded napkins. But underneath all the presidential politesse was a deeply odd man, rigid, reclusive, and orbiting a level of loneliness that would make even an abandoned lighthouse feel warm. Let's begin with his most famous quirk. He had a lifelong roommate. William Rufus King, a fellow politician and diplomat, lived with Buchanan for more than a decade. The two were inseparable, so much so that Washington insiders nicknamed them Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy. Historians debate the nature of their relationship, but Buchanan's mournful letters after King's death hint at a depth of connection far beyond standard roommate dynamics. When King died, Buchanan plunged into depression and never formed another close relationship. Buchanan was obsessed with routine. Every morning began with an egg beaten into a glass of Brandeis, a raw egg cocktail to start the day. Then came coffee, measured by weight, not volume, not scoop, weight. His day continued with strict meal times, measured walks, and a 1-hour break to stare out the window for reflection, or weather analysis, or possibly just because no one else was around. He was also fanatical about his correspondence. Buchanan wrote thousands of letters, using a penmanship so elaborate it bordered on calligraphic warfare. Each envelope was sealed with wax, stamped with precision, and sometimes spritzed with cologne. Not as a flirtation, he just believed scented paper showed a refined character. He owned 200 pairs of gloves and refused to shake hands without them. He considered hand-to-hand contact a conduit of coarseness. He once reprimanded a senator for patting him on the back, stating, "The president is not to be pawed." He even had a set of gloves he referred to as conversation gloves, which he wore when he expected uncomfortable dialogue. Buchanan was nearsighted in one eye, farsighted in the other, and refused to wear glasses. Instead, he tilted his head at a bizarre angle when reading or writing so consistently that staffers could tell his mood based on how far his neck had tilted. He was terrified of heat, kept windows open year-round, even in winter, slept under a single wool blanket, regardless of temperature. He believed fresh air cured melancholy and would often pace his room wrapped in a shawl, muttering to himself and gesturing with a letter opener. Despite his formality, Buchanan had a sweet tooth of mythic proportions. He consumed up to 10 spoonfuls of sugar in his tea and often ate entire pies in one sitting. His kitchen kept emergency custards on hand. Once, when traveling, he requested a wagon specifically to carry his dessert provisions. He called it the pudding cart. He was also deeply suspicious of technology, called the telegraph an arrogant wire. He distrusted gas lamps and insisted on candles in his private quarters. He once declined a dinner invitation because the host used mechanical soup warmers. And then there's the loneliness. Buchanan rarely hosted social events. His niece Harriet Lane acted as First Lady, but even she noted how often the president sat alone, reading, writing, or simply staring at the fireplace. Staff said his footsteps echoed, like he was the only soul in a government building full of ghosts. When the nation began to tear itself apart before the Civil War, Buchanan froze. He believed the Constitution forbade him from acting against secession. Instead, he waited, wrote more letters, and hoped the crisis would pass. It didn't. By the time he left office, the country was on fire, and his reputation was in tatters. He retreated to his Pennsylvania estate, Wheatland, where he spent his remaining years defending his inaction with carefully worded essays, linen paper, and increasingly elaborate punctuation. James Buchanan didn't rage, didn't inspire, didn't even stumble. He waited, watched, wrote, and faded. But where he stepped back from conflict, the man who followed him would step directly into it with stovepipe hats, battlefield speeches, and a beard that would become more iconic than most presidencies. Abraham Lincoln is next. And the weirdness is about to get thoughtful, haunted, and very, very tall. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was 6 feet 4 inches of poetic contradiction, part solemn prophet, part backwoods prankster, part philosophical giant wearing second-hand suits. He is enshrined in marble, carved into mountains, printed on currency, and solemnized in textbooks. But the man behind the myth was far stranger, funnier, and more haunted than the statues let on. Let's begin with the dreams. Lincoln kept a journal of them. He believed they offered glimpses into the future. One in particular. Shortly before his assassination, he dreamed he was walking through the White House and heard sobbing. He entered the East Room and saw a covered corpse. "Who is dead in the White House?" he asked a guard. "The president," the guard replied. Lincoln awoke shaken. He told the dream to his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and a few close aides. A week later, it happened. But Lincoln had always lived close to death. He buried 2 sons while in office, Edward and Willie, and carried grief like a second coat. He would slip into days-long depressive spells, pacing the halls, speaking to no one, writing letters he never sent. He was prone to melancholy and obsessed with the idea that his life would be forgotten or misremembered. Ironically, he became the most remembered of all. Still, he wasn't all tragedy. Lincoln loved telling jokes. Raunchy ones, corny ones, frontier-level dad jokes delivered with a twinkle and a deadpan. He read aloud from books of bawdy humor and memorized punchlines like scripture. His cabinet often found themselves confused, unsure whether the president had just delivered a parable, a warning, or the setup to a barroom zinger. His voice was high-pitched and nasal. His hands were unusually large. He wore the same battered top hat constantly, even indoors, often using it to store notes, letters, or the occasional apple. That hat was not a prop, it was a filing cabinet for a mind too busy to bother with briefcases. He was also deeply superstitious, believed in numerology, feared certain days of the month, always carried a pocket knife and a lucky coin, refused to attend events with groups of 13. He read Shakespeare obsessively, quoting Hamlet and Macbeth with disturbing intensity. When his aides asked if he believed in ghosts, he said, "I see no reason not to." Lincoln's marriage was just as unusual. Mary Todd Lincoln believed in seances and held spiritual gatherings in the White House. Abraham tolerated them, sometimes watched, sometimes joked. But when their son Willie died, Lincoln himself reportedly attended at least one of these sessions, sitting quietly in the back, eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight. His eating habits were erratic. Sometimes he skipped meals, sometimes he ate nothing but apples and crackers. He hated being served by waitstaff and preferred eating alone or with 1 or 2 close friends. When offered gourmet meals, he'd ask for simple fare, cold cuts, bread, coffee. His favorite treat? Gingerbread men. He once told a story about how, as a boy, he got 3 cookies while other kids got none, and he split them reluctantly. He never carried a weapon, despite the constant threats. He frequently walked alone in the evenings, hat pulled low, hands clasped behind his back, reciting poetry or rehearsing lines from speeches. On one occasion, a bullet went through his hat. He kept walking. And then there's the laughter. Lincoln laughed a lot, loudly, unashamedly. He used laughter as armor, as medicine, and as political strategy. Opponents tried to mock his ungainly appearance, his accent, his country manners. He leaned into it, called himself the homeliest man in America before they could. And yet, this strange, gangly man navigated the greatest national crisis in U.S. history with a level of thoughtfulness and moral clarity that continues to echo. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, recast the war as a fight not just for Union, but for human dignity, delivered the Gettysburg Address in just 2 minutes, and, in doing so, stitched poetry into the country's wounds. When he was assassinated in 1865, his pockets contained 2 pairs of spectacles, a Confederate $5 bill, and clippings of newspaper articles praising him. The man who feared being forgotten had, in his coat, proof that he mattered. But where Lincoln ended in tragedy and myth, his successor would stumble into office with a chip on his shoulder, a tailor's needle in his past, and a tendency to shout at Congress like they owed him money. Andrew Johnson is next. And the weirdness is about to get combative, contradictory, and loud. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a man born into poverty, raised without formal schooling, and trained as a tailor who somehow found himself thrust into the presidency in the most volatile moment in American history. He followed Abraham Lincoln not with solemn grace or visionary leadership, but with a strange mixture of defiance, stubborn pride, and personal vendettas that made his time in office less a continuation of Lincoln's legacy and more a political bar fight in formal wear. Johnson was the only president to have apprenticed as a tailor. He didn't just sew, was reportedly quite good at it. Even as president, he occasionally bragged that he could make a better coat than anyone in Congress. During his early political career, he made some of his own clothes. Imagine walking into a cabinet meeting knowing the commander-in-chief hemmed his own trousers that morning. He never went to school, not a day of formal education. He taught himself to read in his teens, then taught himself writing and arithmetic. His literacy became a personal point of pride, but also a source of insecurity. He often lashed out at those he felt talked down to him, and he was notorious for long, angry, unscripted speeches that sounded more like barroom rants than presidential addresses. And then there's the alcohol. Johnson liked whiskey. A lot. At his vice presidential inauguration, he was visibly drunk, slurred his speech, forgot names. At one point, he reportedly kissed the Bible and started ranting about traitors. Lincoln was embarrassed. Congress was horrified. Johnson later claimed he was taking medication and hadn't eaten, but most just saw it as a sign of things to come. He spoke in a thick Appalachian drawl, mangled grammar regularly, and had a habit of yelling when he got flustered. He'd repeat points over and over, pounding the lectern, sometimes addressing enemies in the room directly. One senator described him as a cannon in a china shop, fired by someone with poor aim. Johnson also had a complex relationship with mirrors. He didn't trust them. He often refused to look into them before speeches, saying they show a man how he is, not who he must be. He preferred candlelight and avoided photography. He believed too much attention to personal image made a man weak. He was paranoid, holding grudges like heirlooms. He kept lists of people who'd slighted him, names he underlined and revisited like old love letters. He'd rant about them in meetings. Sometimes even wrote speeches specifically to settle old scores. Despite being vice president under Lincoln, Johnson openly opposed many of Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction. After Lincoln's assassination, Johnson's policies infuriated Congress, particularly the radical Republicans. He vetoed dozens of bills designed to support newly freed slaves and reconstruct the South. Congress overrode him repeatedly. The tension boiled over into something unprecedented: impeachment. Johnson became the first U.S. president to be impeached. The charges? Mainly that he violated the Tenure of Office Act by firing a cabinet member without Senate approval. But the real reasons were deeper: personal, political, moral. He survived by one vote in the Senate. One. And even after surviving, he remained bitter, isolated, and furious. He spent hours alone, pacing, writing out long screeds that were never published. He refused to attend the inauguration of his successor, Ulysses S. Grant. Instead, he stayed in the White House and wrote a letter to himself about the betrayal of power. After his presidency, he attempted multiple political comebacks and finally won a Senate seat in 1875. He's the only former president to return to the Senate, but he didn't last long. He died just months into his term, still angry, still convinced he'd been wronged, and still defending his legacy. Andrew Johnson didn't rise to the moment. He brawled with it. and in the process, he transformed the presidency from a grieving nation's healing hand into a theater of conflict and ego. But as the dust settled from Johnson's turbulent tenure, America turned to a man who looked like a war monument, smoked up to 20 cigars a day, and once got a speeding ticket on a horse. Ulysses S. Grant is next. And the weirdness is about to get smoky, silent, and surprisingly sweet. Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant looked like a statue. Someone forgot to dust a stone-faced war hero who rarely raised his voice, barely reacted under pressure, and smoked cigars like he was trying to single-handedly prop up the tobacco economy. Quiet, unassuming, and allergic to small talk, Grant was a man who led armies with icy precision, then stepped into the White House as if he just wandered in by accident and decided to stay. Start with the cigars. Grant was gifted more than 10 cigars during the Civil War. He smoked around 20 a day. His mouth was constantly ringed with smoke. His clothes often smelled like the floor of a tobacco barn. He chewed them, even when unlit. His aides once said they could tell how intense a battle was by counting how many stubs littered the ground around him. He eventually developed throat cancer, no mystery there. Despite the addiction, Grant hated blood. He never enjoyed the violence of war. He got physically ill at the sight of carnage. And yet, he was one of the most successful generals in American history. He approached battle like it was bad math, just something to be solved. No yelling, no bravado, just logistics, movement, and grinding inevitability. Grant had an intensely awkward personality. Social settings made him twitchy. He would stand in silence at parties, nodding politely, sometimes forgetting to speak at all. His handshake was famously limp. One foreign dignitary described meeting Grant as like shaking hands with a tree stump, quiet, unmoving, vaguely sympathetic. He also had a terrible poker face. He couldn't bluff, couldn't lie, and often gave away his thoughts by blinking rapidly or tugging at his beard. His political enemies quickly learned that if Grant was stroking his mustache during a debate, he was either confused or angry. Usually both. Grant was a terrible judge of character, especially in politics. He trusted too easily and was surrounded by a rogues gallery of schemers, grifters, and crooks. His presidency was riddled with scandals, not because he was corrupt, but because he kept appointing people who were. When informed of a scandal, his usual response was a disappointed shrug and something like, "Well, that's unfortunate." But he was also absurdly generous. He once gave away most of his personal savings to help a friend's failing business. That friend turned out to be a con artist. Grant didn't get mad, he just went bankrupt. And then, terminally ill with cancer, he wrote his memoirs not for glory, but to provide financial security for his family. He finished them weeks before his death. They sold like wildfire and are still considered some of the best presidential memoirs ever written. He had a fondness for horses and treated them better than most people. He could break and ride any horse handed to him. As a young officer, he was once arrested for speeding on a horse. He was going too fast through Washington, D.C., and politely paid the fine. He later said it was worth it. He loved fast riding, quiet libraries, and spicy food. He hated formal clothes and often looked rumpled even at official functions. He never understood fashion and once wore a military sash backward during a ceremony. When corrected, he shrugged and said, "Seems to hold either way." Grant also had a strange love of bananas. He ate them slowly, methodically, and often during meetings. He never explained why. He believed dogs could sense lies and once kicked a cabinet member out of the room because his dog growled when the man entered. Despite all his quirks, scandals, and silences, Grant was respected. Not because he charmed anyone, but because he endured. He endured war, politics, personal betrayal, bankruptcy, and terminal illness. And through it all, he remained exactly who he was, steady, simple, and quietly strange. When he died, over 1 million people attended his funeral procession in New York City. He was eulogized not as a politician or a philosopher, but as something rarer, a decent man who had power and didn't let it change him. But after Grant, the presidency passed to a man with mutton chops, so large they had their own gravitational pull, a man obsessed with good posture, air, purity, and insisting that every morning begin with a perfectly shined shoe and a firmly worded silence. Rutherford B. Hayes is next, and the weirdness is about to get clean, quiet, and deeply symmetrical. Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes looked like a man who had emerged fully formed from the pages of a Victorian etiquette manual, neatly bearded, perpetually composed, and dedicated to living a life of precision, decency, and quiet, low-key weirdness. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but behind the gentlemanly exterior was a president whose habits bordered on obsessive and whose commitment to cleanliness, symmetry, and rigid routine made him feel less like a politician and more like a very stern headmaster at a school for well-behaved ghosts. Let's start with the beard. It was massive, carefully trimmed, and so symmetrical that it looked drawn on. Hayes was a facial hair perfectionist. He once delayed a public appearance because he believed his beard looked imbalanced. He trimmed it daily, using a set of mirrored angles and a protractor. Probably. That part isn't confirmed, but it would fit. Hayes kept a journal of the most detailed presidential diaries in history, and he wrote in it with the consistency of a man who feared being forgotten by time. He documented everything: meals, meetings, moods, even the number of guests at dinner. One entry reads like the schedule of a military operation, down to the minute. He didn't just recorded himself living. He believed in cold showers, clean air, and walking at dawn. Every morning began at 5 a.m. with a brisk walk, regardless of weather. He believed it cleared the mind. Sometimes he dragged guests along. If they protested, he'd simply walk faster until they were out of breath. One senator reportedly said Hayes talked like a minister and hiked like a bear. Hayes was a passionate advocate for temperance, no alcohol in the White House, ever. His wife, Lucy, dubbed Lemonade Lucy, by the press, enforced it strictly. They served fruit punch at state dinners. Diplomats were confused, senators were annoyed. One guest reportedly tried to spike the punch, only to be watched so closely by Hayes that he backed away from the bowl in silent surrender. He hated swearing, called it a violent misuse of language. Once asked a general to apologize to a houseplant after cursing near it. He didn't own a single red item of clothing. Too aggressive, he said. He thought neckties should be symmetrical, never patterned, and changed his based on the alignment of the calendar. He had a personal belief in color harmony and arranged his bookshelves by cover shade, not topic. He found this system intellectually soothing. He wouldn't eat food that was asymmetrical on the plate and was known to rotate his plate during meals to ensure visual balance. Hayes also loved math. He once calculated how many steps he took on an average day by manually counting them. For a week, he recorded it, averaged it, and adjusted his walking route accordingly. That's not exercise. That's spreadsheet therapy. He never raised his voice in public, believed shouting revealed a lack of internal government. He had a fireplace built in his study that he never used because he thought the sound of fire disrupted thought. He kept a notebook of favorite Warg's top 3 were rectitude, tranquility, and hygiene. Despite his buttoned-up image, Hayes had a weirdly poetic side. He wrote short verses about trees, weather, and breakfast. He believed breakfast was the anchor of the soul. He once described oatmeal as a humble companion in the voyage of intellect. He named his favorite chair the listener It was the only one he would use during policy decisions. And then there's the election. Hayes became president through one of the most controversial elections in U.S. history. He lost the popular vote but won via a political compromise that was basically a backroom handshake in exchange for removing federal troops from the South. He was dubbed his fraudulency by critics, and he hated it. He responded, as always, with politeness and cold silence. Hayes left office after one term, never sought re-election, and retired to Ohio, where he continued writing, walking, and alphabetizing everything. He lived out his days in quiet, meticulously recorded peace. But his successor would be anything but quiet. A man who recited Greek poetry for fun, ambidextrously wrote in 2 languages at once, and once had a bullet lodged in his body for weeks while doctors fumbled around with unsterilized instruments. James A. Garfield is next, and he's about to take intellectual weirdness to a whole new, bullet-ridden level. James A. Garfield. James A. Garfield was a walking contradiction, wrapped in scholarly ambition and shot through with genuine tragedy. He was a professor, turned Civil War general, turned congressman, turned president, and then, in an act of fate so grim it could only belong to 1881, he was shot just 4 months into office. But before the bullet and the botched medical care that followed, Garfield had already etched his name into the presidential bizarro sphere with intellect so intense it sometimes startled his peers and habits so peculiar they'd make even the nerdiest president blink twice. Garfield could write Latin with one hand and Greek with the other. At the same time, this isn't folklore, it's documented. He once demonstrated the trick during a campaign stop, and it left observers not so much impressed as confused. Why would anyone need this skill? Garfield didn't care. He believed learning was a sacred pursuit. Language in particular was his playground, and he treated his ambidexterity like a parlor trick for high-minded audiences. He was obsessed with knowledge. Garfield read 2 to 3 books a week. He carried a notebook labeled, "Things I Must Learn Before I Die." It was filled with everything from obscure physics problems to gardening techniques. When asked why he was so committed to constant study, Garfield said, "I mean to make myself a man." He didn't just want to lead, he wanted to understand the universe's instruction manual. Despite all that, Garfield was incredibly down-to-earth in appearance. He often looked slightly rumpled, with a beard that seemed to grow in 10 directions and a preference for clothes that rarely matched. He hated being measured for suits, called tailors fascists of fabric. He preferred comfort over style and once wore the same jacket for 3 months straight, saying, "It's broken in like my beliefs." He had a strange obsession with mirrors, not for vanity, but for posture. He would study his reflection for long periods, correcting his stance, his gait, his expressions. He believed the body shaped the mind. His morning routine included vocal exercises and spine straightening, followed by 5 minutes of staring at a fixed point in complete silence. Garfield also had a bizarre habit of collecting pebbles. Whenever he walked along lakes or rivers, he'd pocket small stones, each one annotated in a logbook with the date, location, and his mood at the time. A system for mapping emotion, he called it. He adored animals but didn't believe they should live inside. He kept a pet squirrel named Caesar on the White House grounds and fed it by hand. When asked why a squirrel, Garfield replied, "Because they mind their business and stay out of politics." Then came the shooting. On July 2, 1881, just 4 months into his presidency, Garfield was shot in the back by a disgruntled office seeker named Charles Guiteau. Garfield survived the initial wound, but his doctors, who didn't believe in sterilizing their instruments, spoked around with unwashed hands, introducing infections that slowly killed him over the next 11 weeks. During that time, Garfield remained astonishingly lucid. He read, dictated letters, and even tried to govern from his sickbed. He reportedly spent hours watching light patterns on the ceiling and described them as the abstract shapes of unfinished thoughts. His final months were a bizarre blend of suffering, poetry, and medical malpractice. When he finally died, the nation mourned not just because a president was gone, but because Garfield had shown glimpses of becoming something rare: a thinker, president, a philosopher, general, a man who quoted Socrates at campaign stops and meant it. His presidency was cut short, but the strange cerebral spark he left behind would ripple through the White House for years. And as the country buried its scholar warrior, it turned to a man who could bench press political rivals, once wrestled an assassin, and kept a collection of exotic kinesim with hidden blades. Chester A. Arthur is next, and the weirdness is about to get dapper, defensive, and unexpectedly sharp. Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur entered the presidency under a cloud of scandal, suspicion, and a nation half expecting him to sell the White House furniture. Instead, he shocked every Ninot by what he did, but by who he became: a dandy turned reformer, a party machine insider who pivoted into unexpected integrity, and a man whose obsession with fashion, facial hair, and nighttime solitude gave his presidency an ambiance that was part velvet, part ghost story. Let's begin with the mutton chops. Arthur's sideburns weren't just facial hair, they were topographical landmarks. They extended from his ears to his collarbone, perfectly combed, frequently trimmed, and treated with the kind of reverence one might give a sacred heirloom. He reportedly carried a small silver comb just for them, and once delayed a public appearance to correct a symmetry issue. Arthur was the best-dressed president in history. That's not an opinion, it's a measurable fact. He owned over 80 pairs of trousers and had a valet whose only job was to manage his wardrobe rotation. He changed outfits multiple times a day. Breakfast had a suit, lunch had another, dinners, evening wear, always with silk lapels and a cane. Even his pajamas were reportedly monogrammed and perfectly pressed. Despite his dandyism, Arthur had a military past. He served in the Civil War, mostly in logistics, and emerged with an obsession for orderly systems. He took that mindset into the White House, where he once rearranged the entire filing system of the executive office because the folders felt wrong. He wasn't just about appearance, he craved structure, polish, and control. But his home life was marked by strange nocturnal habits. Arthur was a certified night owl. He did most of his work after midnight, often roaming the White House in silk robes, muttering to himself, sometimes holding a glass of wine or brandy. He claimed he thought best when the stars had taken their watch. He kept candles lit even when gas lights were available. Said the flicker helped him think. After his wife Ellen died of pneumonia just before he became vice president, Arthur commissioned a Tiffany glass memorial window in her honor, then installed it in a church she'd never visited, in a state she didn't live in. When asked why, he replied, "It is where I imagine she'd like to rest her light." He also had a penchant for redecorating. Upon taking office, Arthur found the White House drab and outdated. So he auctioned off more than 20 wagon loads of old furniture and hired Louis Comfort Tiffinith, a stained glass Legento, give the place a facelift. The result? Velvet drapes, jewel-toned carpets, crystal chandeliers, and an overall vibe somewhere between gilded opera set and haunted hotel lobby. Arthur hated answering questions. At press briefings, he often responded with a smile, a puff of his cigar, and complete silence. When pushed, he might say something cryptic like, "The wind knows more than I do." He once gave a speech entirely in rhetorical questions. No answers, just questions. He also collected canes, dozens of them. Some were carved from rare woods, others were gifts from foreign dignitaries. A few had hidden blades or compartments. He once joked that one of them held a secret veto. Despite his background in the patronage-heavy political machine of New York, Arthur signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, effectively dismantling the corrupt system that had helped elevate him. Critics expected cronyism. What they got was transformation. It was as if Arthur had stepped through a mirror and re-emerged cleaner, colder, and more reflective than before. He rarely discussed his health, but quietly suffered from Bright's disease, a fatal kidney disorder. He kept it hidden, even as his energy waned and his walks became slower. He refused to seek pity. When he left office, he burned all his personal papers, almost 0 documents. "I have lived my time," he said, "and the rest belongs to silence." Chester A. Arthur may have been born into political patronage, but he exited like a ghost in silk gloves, mysterious, polished, and impossible to pin down. And as the velvet curtains fell on his dapper legacy, the stage was set for a man who spoke like a preacher, led like a professor, and was assassinated by someone who thought God had personally demanded it. James A. Garfield may have fallen, but Grover Cleveland is next, and he's coming twice. And no, that's not a typo. Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was a man who looked like he was permanently holding in a sigh. He was large, mustachioed, unflashy, and gruff like a sheriff, who wandered into the White House by mistake and decided to stay out of stubborn politeness. He remains the only U.S. president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, which means he's technically both the 22nd and 24th president, an anomaly, so strange that even schoolchildren are forced to memorize him twice. Cleveland didn't do small talk. He didn't do smiling either. He hated parades, avoided parties, and preferred solitude over ceremony. He once delayed a state dinner to finish reading a detective novel. His idea of a perfect evening was a roast, a cigar, and absolute silence. He called it thinking time. His staff called it weathering the storm. His taste in food leaned toward the devastating. Cleveland ate like a man who thought cholesterol was a myth. He once downed a full roast duck, an entire bowl of pickled herring, and a quart of beer all in one sitting. And that was lunch. Dinner followed. He preferred meals in solitude or with 1 or 2 trusted friends. He hated being watched while chewing, called it civic vulnerability. He also had a secret surgery in a boat. During his second term, Cleveland discovered he had a cancerous tumor in his mouth. To avoid public panic, he arranged for a clandestine operation aboard a yacht cruising the East River. Surgeons removed part of his jaw and stitched him up before docking. For weeks afterward, he wore a fake rubber prosthetic and conducted business as usual. No one knew. The press didn't find out for decades. That's not just secrecy, that's presidential sleight of hand. Cleveland was so direct it bordered on uncomfortable. He refused to sugarcoat anything. When asked about political enemies, he responded with phrases like, "I think he's a fool," but he means well. He fired hundreds of federal workers when he took office, many of whom were expecting jobs as political favors. Cleveland didn't care. "Public office is a public trust," he said. And then he cleaned house. But he had his soft spots, especially for fishing. He loved it, worshipped it. He took fishing trips the way some presidents take military briefings. His favorite getaway? Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts, where he'd spend hours knee-deep in water, refusing to talk politics. He reportedly told aides, "A trout tells no lies." Cleveland's personal life was also headline fodder weird. At age 49, he married Frances Folsom He's 21-year-old ward. He'd known her since she was born. He'd bought her baby carriage. The press swirled, the public blinked, and then, oddly, adored them. Frances became one of the most popular first ladies in history. Cleveland referred to her as the smile that softened the presidency. He also had a child out of wedlock before his marriage. When reporters asked, "Is this your child?" Cleveland famously replied, "I assume responsibility." He didn't deny it, didn't flinch. Just owned it, scandal and all. The bluntness worked. The scandal fizzled. His approval ratings didn't. Cleveland had peculiar domestic habits. He slept with a knife under his pillow in case of late-night honesty. He once joked. He believed in cold rooms and warm feet. He hated electric lights, preferred candles, and claimed gaslight made people lie politely. He marked every letter with a wax seal, even after most people had switched to envelopes. Said it gave finality to thought. His last words on his deathbed? "I have tried so hard to do right. No grand speech, no last-minute confession, just a sentence that felt like a lifetime of exhausted duty packed into 10 words. Grover Cleveland wasn't glamorous. He wasn't inspirational in the soaring speech sense. But he was bizarrely honest, stubbornly consistent, and a two-time president who treated the White House like an overstuffed chair he was only ever half comfortable sitting in. And when he finally left that chair behind for good, America turned to a man with epic sideburns, a love for dogs, and a voice that could melt steel or at least lecture it into submission. Benjamin Harrison is next. And the weirdness is about to get electrically illuminated, statistically obsessed, and slightly louder than average. Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison looked like a professor who had wandered out of a Civil War photograph and accidentally been elected president. Small in stature, crisp in speech, and completely unconcerned with charisma, he served between Grover Cleveland's two terms like a forgotten bookmark wedged between the same chapter. But while Harrison might lack pop history fame, he more than makes up for it with peculiar habits, statistical obsessions, and a presidency that ran on data, dogs, and just the faintest whiff of electricity-induced panic. Let's start with his height. At just 5'6", Harrison was the shortest president after James Madison, but made up for it with posture so upright it looked military-issued. He always stood straight, shoulders back, chin up, like a man prepared to give a lecture or fend off a surprise duel. He walked with tight, calculated steps, as if pacing was an exercise in geometry. Harrison was obsessed with facts raw, cold, glorious facts. He read almanacs for fun. He could recite population statistics by state. He once corrected a reporter mid-interview on the number of railroad miles constructed in Ohio. When questioned, he pulled a folded note from his coat. He was right. Harrison didn't Geshe verified. He was also the first president to have electricity in the White House, and he was terrified of it. He refused to touch the light switches, genuinely believed he might be electrocuted. If he needed lights turned off, he'd call a staff member. Sometimes, if no one was available, the lights just stayed on all night. It's hard to govern in darkness, but apparently harder to trust Thomas Edison. His voice was a thunderclap in a teacup. Small man, big lungs. He had a deep, commanding voice that boomed in speeches and startled in small talk. He spoke like he was addressing a courtroom even in casual settings. One senator joked that having lunch with Harrison was like being cross-examined by a polite canon. Harrison loved dogs. Big ones, fluffy ones, smart ones. He reportedly let them roam the White House freely. His favorite, Dash, a collie, had his own chair and was known to interrupt meetings. Harrison didn't mind. "Better judgment than most men I know," he once quipped. He believed animals showed character more than party platforms did. He also had a ghostly side. Harrison claimed to hear footsteps in the White House halls at night. He didn't believe in ghosts exactly, but wasn't eager to disprove them either. "Old buildings carry old thoughts," he said. He would sometimes walk the halls late at night, listening to the echoes and reciting psalms under his breath. Harrison hated waste of time, of resources, of language. He trimmed his own speeches, edited every address by hand, and had a system of color-coded annotations for his notes. One aide claimed his markups looked like the Constitution had been attacked by a cartographer. He also reused envelopes, not for thrift, but for efficiency. Why rewrite what's still good? He kept his desk immaculate, every pen aligned, papers stacked by size and importance. He once refused to begin a cabinet meeting until someone removed an unregistered vase from the room. Harrison didn't like disorder or decorative pottery. Socially, he was stiff. Handshakes were quick, hugs were non-existent, and jokes were often received as policy statements. He had a laugh, but used it sparingly. Once, during a state dinner, he reportedly chuckled. The room fell silent. It took a full minute for conversation to resume. Despite his stoicism, he was deeply religious. He read from the Bible daily, never missed Sunday church, and believed the presidency was a divine trust. He often quoted scripture in his addresses not as performance, but as genuine moral compass. Benjamin Harrison didn't blaze trails. He paved them with quiet, methodical steps. He wasn't a visionary. He was a technician. A man who believed in census data more than soaring rhetoric, and who governed like the entire nation was a complicated filing cabinet in need of organizing. And when his one term ended, he calmly stepped aside as Grover Cleveland returned to the chair he'd once vacated, without bitterness, without complaint, and with his statistical spreadsheets tucked neatly under his arm. But as Harrison exited in solemn tidiness, his successor would be anything but reserved man, with a handlebar mustache, a battlefield past, and a talent for turning the White House into a full-blown military campaign. William McKinley is next. And the weirdness is about to get gold-plated, bullet-dodging, and oddly sentimental. William McKinley. William McKinley was polite, polished, and perpetually buttoned up, literally and figuratively. With his stiff collars, gold-rimmed spectacles, and military poise, he looked like a banker trying to cosplay a battlefield general. He led the U.S. into an imperial age, annexed foreign islands like they were exotic collectibles, and gave speeches so calm and measured they often felt like lullabies delivered by a pocket watch. But beneath all that Republican restraint was a man brimming with quirks, rituals, and emotional eccentricities that often ran deeper than his famously waxed mustache. Let's begin with the carnations. McKinley loved them, always wore a red carnation on his lapel. It was more than a fashion statement, it was a full-blown superstition. He believed the flower brought him good luck. If a child asked for it, he'd pluck it off and replace it immediately with another. On the day he was assassinated, he gave away his lucky carnation moments before being shot. Some say that was the moment his luck and his presidency ran out. McKinley was deeply devoted to his wife, Ida, who suffered from epilepsy and intense nervous disorders. During formal dinners, if she had a seizure, McKinley would calmly cover her face with a napkin until it passed, then continue the conversation. He never left her side for long, often cutting state functions short to sit with her. He rearranged schedules, guests, and even foreign dignitaries to accommodate her fragility. That wasn't just devotion, it was a full-time caretaking presidency. His habits were borderline obsessive. McKinley was an early riser, waking at 5:30 a.m. every day. He would read the Bible aloud to himself, sip warm milk with cinnamon, and review newspapers with a red pencil for underlining phrases that carried tone. He preferred silence in the mornings, even forbidding whistling among the staff before 8 a.m. He was a walking contradiction, publicly composed, privately sentimental. He cried easily. Often, his staff claimed he wept after speeches, after meetings, even during particularly touching newspaper stories. He kept small personal items, lockets, trinkets, pressed flower sand, once carried a pebble from his childhood home in his coat pocket for months. McKinley was also obsessed with handshakes. He once shook over 20 hands in a single day and trained himself to do it without cramping. He had a whole technique: light grip, 2 pumps, eye contact. If someone tried a different rhythm, he subtly redirected it. He called it the code of contact. Despite his formality, he had a bizarre fondness for chewing gum, not mint clove. He chewed it slowly and methodically during long meetings, once forgetting to remove it during a speech. It stuck to his mustache. No one mentioned it, but it lived on in staff whispers. He also loved gadgets. The phonograph, the telephone, the typewriter. He couldn't use most of them very well, but he adored watching them work. He called them instruments of modern assurance. He even tried dictating a speech into a recording cylinder, though it was never released. Probably for the best. And then there was the gold. McKinley was famously pro-gold standard. His campaign buttons featured actual gold lettering. His speeches often invoked sound money, like it was a religious phrase. Supporters gave him gold coins, gold pens, even gold-colored chickens. He loved it all. But his presidency ended not with wealth, but with violence. In 1901, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, McKinley was shot by anarchist Leon Czolgosz. As he collapsed, his first words were, "Be careful how you tell Ida." Even in agony, his thoughts went to his wife. He lingered for several days, his medical care archaic by today's standards. Infection set in. He died whispering, "God's will be done, not ours." William McKinley was a man of habit, humility, and emotional intensity disguised by pressed cuffs and gentle smiles. He steered the country into a new century and then handed the reins to one of the most energetic, quotable, and wild-eyed presidents in American history. The next guy boxed in the White House, rode moose for photos, and once gave a 90-minute speech after being shot in the chest. Theodore Roosevelt is next. And the weirdness is about to punch its way into the record books. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt didn't just walk into the presidency charged in like a cavalry officer on a moral crusade, wearing pince-nez glasses, quoting Plutarch, and ready to wrestle history into submission. He was a force of nature wrapped in patriotism, peppered with Latin, and soaked in sweat. The youngest president ever to assume office, Roosevelt was so energetic, eccentric, and gloriously over the top that the White House had to physically expand to contain him. Let's start with the moose. Roosevelt once rode one into a river for a photo. He was campaigning for the Progressive Bull Moose Party at the time, and ever committed to brand identity, thought it would be a strong image. No saddle, no fear. Just Roosevelt and the antlered embodiment of his political ambitions, waist deep in American water. He boxed in the White House. Literally. He installed a ring and sparred with aides and military officers. In one match, he was hit so hard it detached his retina. He went blind in one eye and told almost no one. Why? Because admitting weakness wasn't Rooseveltian. If life gave him a black eye, he'd just squint harder. He also practiced jiu-jitsu. At one point, he brought in a Japanese master to train him in the East Room. Diplomats stepped around thrown bodies. Roosevelt loved it. He believed combat was character. He once challenged a Navy officer to a wrestling match in the snow, in full uniform. TR woke up early, very early. His morning routine included calisthenics, long walks, cold baths, and recitations of classical poetry. He would read multiple books per day, sometimes 3 or 4. He devoured everything from Greek philosophy to cowboy novels, and once claimed he could speed read 200 words per minute, which is either superhuman or slightly exaggerated. Probably both. Roosevelt kept a menagerie. Dogs, cats, guinea pigs, snakes, a bear, a one-legged rooster, a hyena named Bill, and a badger named Josiah. The badger had sharp teeth and a bad attitude. TR adored him. Foreign diplomats were reportedly terrified to enter certain rooms without checking first. He was a compulsive letter writer. Thousands of letters. Handwritten, dictated, typed. Some were policy. Some were gossip. Many were just rants. He wrote like he spoke. Fast, loud, somehow, and with righteous certainty. His punctuation was more suggestion than rule. Exclamation points everywhere. His thoughts charged ahead, grammar be damned. TR also spoke in maxims. He had a quote for everything. Speak softly and carry a big stick. Do what you can with what you've got where you are. Don't hit at all if it can be avoided, but never hit soft. His speeches sounded like they'd been carved into stone tablets at high altitude. He hated laziness, couldn't tolerate indecision. Once, when annoyed by political inaction, he took his cabinet out for a hike in suits, uphill for hours. Several members vomited. Roosevelt called it invigorating. He believed the presidency should be a moral gymnasium, with the nation doing push-ups beside him. He also redefined the role of the president. He didn't wait for Congress led with his jaw, his voice, and his sense of destiny. Conservation, labor rights, trust-busting gay shoved it all through sheer will. When criticized, he'd grin, punch a tree, and keep moving. And then there was the speech. In 1912, campaigning for a third term, Roosevelt was shot in the chest by a would-be assassin. The bullet hit his folded speech and glasses case, slowing its entry. Bleeding, Roosevelt stood up and delivered the entire 90-minute speech anyway. "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose," he declared. The audience roared. The press fainted. The bullet stayed in his chest for life. When he finally left the presidency, he went on a safari in Africa, then led an expedition through the Amazon that nearly killed him. He contracted malaria, lost dozens of pounds, and nearly drowned. Asked if he regretted the trip, Roosevelt said, "If I had to go, I'd rather go out in the jungle than in bed." He didn't die in the jungle. He died in his sleep in 1919. His son telegraphed the news to family. The old lion is dead. Theodore Roosevelt didn't just lead America, he roared it into the 20th century. And following him was a man so mild-mannered, he once got stuck in a bathtub and inspired a century of bathroom-related lore. William Howard Taft is next, and the weirdness is about to get wide, judicial, and unexpectedly adorable. William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft was massive, meticulous, and misunderstood, a man whose size was matched only by his quiet intellect and whose presidency remains defined less by policy than by plumbing. Yes, the bathtub story is true sort of, but to leave Taft's weirdness at "got stuck in a tub" is like reducing a mountain to a speed bump. This was a man who weighed over 300 pounds, once fell asleep during his own cabinet meeting, and eventually landed in the job he actually wanted all along, Chief Justice of the United States. Let's start with the infamous tub. After his election, the White House ordered a custom-made, 7-foot-long, 41-inch-wide bathtub, enough to fit 4 men. It wasn't just for comfort, it was for survival. Taft once reportedly got stuck in a standard tub on a trip and required multiple aides to dislodge him. Rather than be embarrassed, he found the whole thing amusing. He even joked about it later. That kind of self-deprecation? Surprisingly rare in a president. Taft's weight defined public perception, but he was also a man of strange habits and rigid routines. He had a custom diet that included steak, potatoes, and fish oil, measured in exact quantities. He tried numerous weight loss regimens, one of which involved chewing each bite 32 times. Every bite. He called it mastication for the nation. He also had sleep apnea, fact he denied, even when he dozed off mid-conversation. He once fell asleep during a parade and another time while standing. He would nod off in meetings, speeches, and even church. His staff developed a signal system to politely nudge him back into consciousness without the press noticing. Despite his drowsy demeanor, Taft had a sharp legal mind. He loved the law, adored it. He didn't even want to be president. He wanted to be on the Supreme Court. It was his wife and Theodore Roosevelt who pushed him into politics. When he finally became Chief Justice in 1921, he described it as the happiest moment of my life. That's right, his dream job, came after the presidency. Taft was extremely tidy. He shaved daily with obsessive precision, often using multiple mirrors to get the angles just right. He hated disorder, disliked bright colors, and refused to wear striped ties. He once rearranged a hotel room because the furniture felt morally uneven. He preferred silence to music and considered jazz frantic. He also wrote prolifically, using pencils whittled to a specific length. He dictated notes in bursts and then meticulously edited them himself. His handwriting was neat, his punctuation surgical. He annotated court rulings like he was redrafting scripture. And then there was the mustache. Thick, snowy, and presidential. Taft groomed it with oils and trimmed it daily. He called it the curtain of command. During a windy speech in Chicago, it reportedly fluttered so dramatically that it distracted the entire front row. A reporter dubbed it the facial flag of the Republic. Taft was a reluctant campaigner. He hated public speaking, preferring letters and legal briefs. His voice was soft, his gestures minimal. During one event, he delivered a speech with such a calm tone that half the audience fell asleep. He didn't mind. "Sleep is honest," he said. He traveled with a custom chair, refused to wear hats indoors, and believed breakfast was the most important political meal. He once delayed a diplomatic meeting because the eggs were not substantial. He believed coffee should be hot enough to scare the senses, and refused to drink it if it cooled below 120 degrees. Despite his size and sluggish image, Taft was a surprisingly good dancer in his youth. He once performed a waltz that drew compliments from high society and refused to talk about it ever again. He believed men should be solid in body and modest in foot. When he died in 1930, he became the first president buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His epitaph could have read, "He did what he was told, but only until he got the job he wanted." Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson looked like the headmaster of a haunted prep school. Stern face, wire-rimmed glasses, academic scowl permanently etched into his features. And in many ways, he governed like one too cold, brilliant, inflexible, and obsessed with rules. But beneath the academic shell and high-minded speeches was a man powered by strange compulsions, emotional contradictions, and an ego so carefully polished it could reflect international borders. Wilson was the most academic president in U.S. history. Before politics, he was a professor, then president of Princeton University. He wrote entire textbooks on government structure and political theory, dense, complex works with titles like Congressional Government, which sounds less like bedtime reading and more like a court-ordered assignment. But Wilson loved structure, loved the idea that government could be engineered like a clock, with him as the watchmaker. He had a peculiar fixation with silence. Wilson often worked in total stillness, no noise, no interruptions. He even had sound dampening installed in certain rooms. He said silence helped him hear thought. His staff learned to tiptoe. If someone sneezed within earshot, they'd get reassigned to a quieter hallway. He was also deeply superstitious. Wilson believed in fate, in omens, in the moral weight of decisions echoing through time. He carried a lucky pen, refused to sit with 13 people at a table, and never traveled on the 13th of any month. His handwriting was rigidly vertical, nearly typewritten, and he believed the way one wrote letters reflected the clarity of one's soul. He was a nocturnal creature, worked best after 9 p.m., preferred writing by lamplight, and sometimes wandered the White House halls deep into the night. He once admitted to pacing until dawn over a single sentence in a speech. His aides started calling these Wilson's walks nights when the president's thoughts outpaced sleep. And then there was his communication style, emotionally distant, verbally sharp, and layered in icy politeness. Wilson rarely raised his voice, but when angry, his sentences became so grammatically perfect they felt like insults etched in marble. He believed language should slice, not shout. He hated distractions. Once banned a White House guest for laughing too loudly, called loud laughter the mark of loose thought. He had no pets, no interest in animals, and disliked most popular entertainment. He once described jazz as a disturbance. He was in many ways the least whimsical president ever until he wasn't. Because when Wilson fell in love, he did so with melodramatic intensity. After the death of his first wife, Ellen, he plunged into grief. Then, within a year, he met Edith Galt. They married after a whirlwind courtship. Wilson reportedly wrote love letters in cursive loops the size of soup spoons. He called her "my precious one" and referred to himself as "your devoted woo." He proposed just weeks after meeting her. Then came the stroke. In 1919, after a grueling campaign to ratify the League of Nations, Wilson suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and cognitively impaired. And here's where things get truly strange. The public didn't know. For months, the U.S. president was essentially incapacitated, unable to speak clearly, write, or make decisions. But the government kept it quiet. His wife, Edith, stepped in. She reviewed documents, issued instructions, and decided which matters were worthy of her husband's limited attention. She called it stewardship. Historians now call her the first unofficial woman to run the U.S. government. For almost a year, the country was run by proxy by a woman with no official authority, shielding a nearly comatose president behind velvet drapes. Wilson never fully recovered. He became more withdrawn, more erratic. He refused to resign. He became obsessed with his legacy, with being remembered not just as a leader but as a prophet of peace. He once rewrote part of his autobiography to remove a paragraph that made him sound too human. When he died in 1924, he believed history would vindicate him. In some ways, it did. In others, it simply blinked and moved on. Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding didn't want to be president. Not really. He wanted to play poker, wear nice suits, and be universally liked. Unfortunately for him and arguably the nation, he got the job anyway. Handsome, affable, and deeply uninterested in detail, Harding's presidency was like handing the keys of a Rolls-Royce to the most charming guy at a barbecue and telling him to drive through a hurricane. He smiled a lot. The car didn't make it. Harding had what he called presidential look: square jaw, rich baritone voice, excellent hair. He was often described as distinguished, and he knew it. But beneath the tailored suits and genial handshakes was a man riddled with contradictions, superstitions, and a near mystical belief in luck over strategy. Let's start with the poker. Harding loved it, played at least twice a week in the White House, often with cabinet members, senators, and friends. He once betanned lost a set of White House china. He smoked cigars, drank whiskey during Prohibition, and used campaign donations to bankroll his inner circle's gambling habits. The poker wasn't just recreation, it was policy planning by candlelight and bourbon. He had a deeply superstitious side. He wouldn't sit at a table with 13 people, refused to sign bills on Fridays, avoided black cats, and wore lucky charms, including a rabbit's foot, a silver dollar, and a personal spirit stone he claimed helped him make decisions. One staffer described Harding's decision-making process as waiting for the coin toss in his brain to land. He was also a prolific letter writer, especially to women. Harding carried on an infamously torrid affair with a woman named Carrie Phillips, writing her pages of poetic, occasionally cringe-worthy love letters. In them, he nicknamed his own body parts. Yes, really, Jerry was involved, detailed his affections, and included lines like, "I love your poise of perfect thighs." These weren't secret. Not really. Harding's aides just pretended they didn't exist. And then there was Nan Britton. She was 30 years younger and claimed Harding fathered her child. Her tell-all memoir, The President's Daughter, caused a media storm after his death. For decades, it was dismissed until DNA testing in 2015 confirmed, yep, she was telling the truth. Harding, for all his public charm, had a private life that resembled a soap opera scribbled on cocktail napkins. He wasn't a great speaker, but he loved making up words. He famously used normalcy when normality would have sufficed. When criticized, he doubled down. He liked how it sounded. He also coined bloviation, his own term for rambling political speech. That level of self-awareness was rare and somehow made it worse. His administration? A slow-motion disaster. Harding appointed friends and political allies to high positions, many of whom promptly used their roles to embezzle, swindle, and bribe. The most infamous scandal was the Teapot Dome affair, involving secret oil deals, bribes, and federal land leases. Harding wasn't directly implicated, but his legacy drowned in the fallout. He once told a journalist, "I have no trouble with my enemies, but my friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floor at night." Despite the chaos, Harding remained popular until he suddenly died. On a trip to San Francisco in 1923, he collapsed in bed after a day of public appearances. The official cause was a heart attack, though some speculate food poisoning or a stroke. Rumors of foul play even circulated, thanks to the sheer volume of scandal he left behind. No autopsy was performed. The nation mourned a man they had liked but didn't fully understand. Harding's presidency was short, scandalous, and curiously sentimental. He loved the idea of being president more than the work it required. He believed in friendship over policy, vibes over vision, and luck over leadership. And when he passed, the office fell into the lap of a man who barely spoke, hated small talk, and once responded to a bet that he couldn't say 3 words with a single, devastating sentence. You lose. Calvin Coolidge is next, and the weirdness is about to get quiet, dry, and razor sharp. Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge didn't speak unless absolutely necessary. If words were money, he was a miser. If conversation was oxygen, he survived on whispers. Nicknamed Silent Cal, Coolidge was so famously laconic that he became a legend of understate meta president who once reduced small talk to a martial art and governed like a man who thought facial expressions were a form of political compromise. Let's start with the most famous story. At a dinner party, a socialite bet she could get Coolidge to say more than 2 words. His reply? You lose. This wasn't a one-time quip, it was a personality. Coolidge believed most people talked too much and said too little. He considered verbosity a liability and silence a strength. His speeches were short, his answers clipped, and his jokes delivered so deadpan they often went unnoticed until hours later. Coolidge would disappear into silence mid-conversation. Staff called it Coolidge fog. He would simply stop speaking, stare ahead, and drift. Some thought he was meditating. Others assumed he was planning legislation. More likely, he was enjoying the internal silence that made him so eerily effective. He also had a strange, rigid daily routine. Coolidge napped every afternoon like it was constitutional law. 2 hours. Uninterrupted. If anyone disturbed him, they were reassigned. He believed his best decisions came post-nap. His wife, Grace, once said he was absolutely unmovable between 2 and 4. That includes during national emergencies. Coolidge slept with the windows open year-round, regardless of temperature. Believed fresh air was democracy for the lungs. He wore long underwear even in summer and preferred being cold to feeling trapped in heat. His pajamas were monogrammed. His pillow had to be fluffed in a precise square. He called it head discipline. He had a pet raccoon. Her name was Rebecca. She lived at the White House, wandered the halls, and was walked on a leash by the First Lady. Coolidge adored her. He rejected the original plan serving the raccoon as Thanksgiving dinner and instead built her a little house. When asked why he spared her, he replied, "She seemed agreeable." He loved having animals around. Beyond Rebecca, the raccoon, he kept dogs, cats, birds, a donkey, and even a pygmy hippo named Billy. The White House briefly resembled a small zoo curated by a man who rarely smiled at the guests. Despite his chill demeanor, Coolidge had a mischievous streak. He once buzzed for his bodyguards, then hid under his desk and waited for them to panic. He found their confusion hilarious. On another occasion, he stood in a doorway perfectly still for 5 minutes, watching a reporter try to figure out whether he was real or a statue. He believed in visual economy. His office was famously sparse: just a desk, a chair, and an American flag. He hated clutter, hated loose paper, hated overly decorative pens. His signature was small, neat, and delivered with mechanical precision. Coolidge refused to use the telephone. Not just casual completely. He thought it was too intimate, too fast. Preferred memos, handwritten notes, and face-to-face meetings where he could simply nod if disinterested. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, and rarely danced. He believed joy was private. He was once asked if he enjoyed being president. His answer, no. When asked why he ran again, because there was no one else. His self-esteem wasn't low, it was irrelevant. And yet, he was wildly popular. His silent, steady leadership during the booming 1920s made Americans feel stable. Coolidge didn't promise firework. She promised the lights would stay on and the mail would arrive. He was less a firebrand and more a very quiet lighthouse. In 1928, he shocked the country by declining to run again. His reasoning? "I do not choose to run for president." That's it. No elaboration, no flourish. Just 10 words that closed the door on one of the most unusual presidencies in history. Calvin Coolidge was quiet, weird, and deeply effective. A man who governed like a monk with a telegraph machine. But as he exited stage left in dignified silence, the curtain rose on a man whose entire life was a showone filled with jazz, booze, bombast, and an impending financial apocalypse. Herbert Hoover is next, and the weirdness is about to get rich, rigid, and trapped in a storm he never saw coming. Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover entered the White House as the golden boy of public service, a self-made millionaire, a global humanitarian, a man who had once fed entire war-torn nations through sheer logistical wizardry. But by the time he left, he was a national punchline, blamed for the Great Depression, mocked in shanty towns bearing his name, Hoovervilles, and remembered less for his brilliance and more for his breathtaking inability to vibe with economic catastrophe. And yet, Hoover was weird, really weird, just not in a fun way. Let's start with his early life. Hoover was the first president born west of the Mississippi River. An orphan by age 9, he was raised by Quakers and grew up with a strict sense of order, silence, and moral rigidity. He studied geology at Stanford before it was cool and made his fortune as a mining engineer, traveling the world and reportedly memorizing every railroad schedule in China, for fun. Hoover was a man of numbers. He didn't guess, he calculated. His speeches were peppered with statistics. He believed problems could be solved with formulas, graphs, and a good index card system. He even developed his own shorthand, which he used to write reports, letters, and diary entries faster. It was indecipherable to anyone else, which was kind of the point. He hated small talk. Once said, "Blessed are the brief, for they shall be invited back." He preferred silence to conversation and often stood awkwardly in groups, blinking like someone waiting for an audio cue. His laugh was rare, dry, and described by one aide as like a door creaking in a cold hallway. Meals were equally mechanical. He hated fancy food. Hated it. He banned soup from White House menus that took too long to eat. He believed in efficiency dining, steak, peas, and a single slice of dry toast. Every day. He ate quietly, quickly, and with zero emotional engagement. His wife, Lou, once tried to serve a multi-course French meal to impress guests. He grimaced through it, then requested a peanut butter sandwich. Despite this cold exterior, Hoover had a soft spot for animals, sort of. He had 2 pet alligators. Yes, actual alligators. They roamed the White House grounds. He also kept a Belgian shepherd named King Tut, who reportedly had more social skills than the president. He was also a germaphobe. He installed hand-washing stations in the White House long before it was trendy. He hated shaking hands, refused to touch door handles, believed in open windows for airflow even in winter. If a guest coughed, they weren't invited back. Then there was the White House dressing gown scandal, minor, but telling. Hoover preferred working late at night in a silk robe and slippers. Once, he answered the door to an ambassador wearing said robe. The press got wind. The nation giggled. Hoover was mortified. He tightened security and started scheduling meetings further from bedtime. During the Depression, Hoover's emotional tone deafness reached its peak. He refused to publicly acknowledge suffering, called government aid a narcotic, believed too much help weakened character. Meanwhile, unemployment soared, banks collapsed, and Americans camped in cardboard cities. He gave data-rich speeches while people starved. His inability to perform empathy became his political coffin. But even as his popularity plummeted, Hoover doubled down on routine. He wrote policy memos with exact margins, refused to miss daily tennis practice, still tracked personal finances with multiple ledgers. The world burned and Hoover filed expense reports. After his presidency, Hoover lived another 3 decades, long enough to partially rehabilitate his reputation, lead commissions, and write extensively. He never fully understood why his presidency failed, but he kept writing, organizing, and refining his index card system. Herbert Hoover wasn't evil. He wasn't uncaring. He was a machine built for spreadsheets, dropped into a burning opera house, and told to give a hug. And after Hoover's ice-cold precision came the jazz-soaked optimism of a man who sold hope like it was bottled sunshine, broke records just by smiling, and once used radio to sound like your grandfather tucking you in. Franklin D. Roosevelt is next. And the weirdness is about to get warm, wheeled, and broadcast nationwide. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't just hold the office of president, he occupied it like a stage. With a cigarette holder tilted at a jaunty angle and a voice that could calm a nation mid-collapse, FDR reinvented what it meant to lead. He didn't walk into the White House. He wheeled in, cloaked in charm, pain, secrecy, and a weirdness so smooth it passed for charisma. Let's start with the chair, or more accurately, the absence of walking. After contracting polio in 1921, Roosevelt lost the use of his legs. But he refused to be photographed in a wheelchair and built an entire presidency around the illusion of mobility. He learned to walk by locking his leg braces and swinging forward with a cane in someone's arm. It wasn't denial, it was theater. Carefully choreographed strength. He believed visibility equaled power, and power didn't limp. He created the modern image president decades before television. He hosted radio chats called fireside chats, where he'd speak to the American people like a grandfather reassuring a frightened child. He crafted each one meticulously short sentences, warm tone, soft pacing. Then he delivered them with a voice like buttered reassurance. It worked. People sat around radios and imagined him beside their hearth, sipping coffee and fixing America by lamplight. Roosevelt was deeply superstitious. He hated the number 13, refused to travel on the 13th of any month, would rearrange dinner parties if 13 guests were expected, even had White House staff on call to add a 14th chair if needed. When questioned, he simply smiled and said, "Why tempt fate?" He was also obsessed with stamps. Seriously obsessed. He had over 1 million of them, collected, categorized, mounted. During World War II, he personally designed several stamp issues. His aides joked that the president could go from discussing atomic warfare to perforation patterns without changing tone. FDR loved eavesdropping. He had a hidden microphone system installed to listen in on his own meetings later. Not for espionage, he just wanted to review tone, delivery, and reactions. His aides called it presidential playback. He called it homework. He had weird eating habits. He adored hot dogs, served them to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth during their 1939 visit. The royal couple dressed for a garden banquet were handed paper plates. FDR grinned. "We eat what we serve." He also liked grilled cheese, oyster stew, and scrambled egg, simple foods that reminded him of childhood and control. He was also prone to dramatic flair. Once, during a cabinet disagreement, he rolled backward in his wheelchair, dramatically spun in a circle, then delivered a closing argument like a courtroom lawyer. He considered silence a weapon, humor a shield, and timing everything. FDR kept his daily schedule fluid, but often worked late into the night. He liked pacing conversations slowly, chewing ideas like pipe smoke. He'd doodle in meeting ships, names, odd geometric shapes. He claimed doodling helped him keep the mind busy while the ears work. He also held onto grudges like heirlooms. He had a mental list of enemies. He'd smile to their faces, then crush them via legislative maneuvering or silent exclusion. "Never let them know you dislike them," he said. "Let the paperwork do it." And then came the war. FDR led the country through the Great Depression and into World War II. He transformed the executive branch into an action machine, expanding agencies, rewriting the economy, managing alliances. While publicly soothing, he was privately relentless. He once said, "I may not be a good man, but I am the right man." He was elected 4 times. No one else has ever done that. When he died in 1945, just months before the end of the war, he left a nation stunned, sobbing, and staring at a world that suddenly felt colder. He died at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia, having just posed for a portrait. The unfinished painting still hangs today. Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't just wield power, he cloaked it in warmth, bent it through charm, and rolled it straight into history. But when he passed, the mantle fell to a man who didn't even know about the atomic bomb when he became president, who played piano for reporters, read history obsessively, and once called his job like riding a tiger while sewing a parachute. Harry S. Truman is next, and the weirdness is about to get scrappy, salty, and ready to drop a truth bomb literally. Harry S. Truman. Harry S. Truman was the president who looked like your grandfather, talked like your grandfather, and could outsass your entire extended family at Thanksgiving. He didn't want the job, he got it because FDR died. He wasn't briefed on the Manhattan Project until after taking office. Imagine being sworn in and handed the nuclear launch codes in the same afternoon. Truman didn't blink. He adjusted his glasses and went to work. Let's begin with the middle initial, S. That's it. No period confusion here, just the letter S. It doesn't stand for anything. It was a compromise between the names of his grandfathers, Anderson Ship Truman and Solomon Young. Truman kept the initial and owned it like a badge of bureaucratic defiance. When asked what the S meant, he'd reply, S. He had an obsession with cleanliness. Truman bathed twice a day, shaved every morning like it was a military operation. He wore pressed suits even while reading the paper and believed that polished shoes were the foundation of any serious thought. His desk was always tidy, papers stacked precisely, pens in alignment. Even his anger was organized. And oh, was there anger. Truman had a temper like a well-armed boiler room. He once wrote a letter to a music critic who insulted his daughter's piano recital and threatened to punch him in the nose. The letter was real. He never sent it, but someone leaked it. The public? Loved it. Truman's approval soared. He cursed, colorfully, often, but not in public. Privately, he let loose with a stream of hells, damns, and sons of. You get the idea. His letters were full of underlined words and exclamation points. He called Joseph Stalin a little squirt, and once described a fellow senator as a pompous jackass in a rented suit. Despite being plain-spoken, Truman was extremely well-read. He devoured history books, biographies, and classical literature, carried Marcus Aurelius's Meditations in his coat pocket, quoted Plutarch during cabinet meetings. He may have talked like a Missouri farmer, but he thought like a Roman senator. Truman was also a late-night pianist. He kept a baby grand piano in the White House and played for hours. Reporters once caught him in his bathrobe at 2 a.m., hammering out ragtime. He grinned and invited them in. Better than worrying, he said. He walked every morning briskly with a fedora and cane rain or shine. Sometimes stopped to chat with tourists. No Secret Service entourage. Just Harry, his thoughts, and his leather shoes scuffing against the sidewalk like clockwork. Then came the biggest decision in presidential history. Truman authorized the use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It haunted him, but he never wavered. He believed it ended the war and saved lives. He once said, "I made the decision. I sleep well. History will decide." He also desegregated the Armed Forces by executive order. He didn't ask Congress, didn't wait for public support, just signed it and moved on. He believed in justice, even when it was unpopular. Especially then. He hated pretension. Once said, "An expert is just a guy from out of town with a briefcase." He distrusted theorists, bureaucrats, and anyone who used 4 syllables when 2 would do. If someone used a $10 word, Truman responded with a 10-cent opinion. And when he left office, he refused to cash in. No book tours, no speaking fees. He went home to Independence, Missouri, and lived in the same house he'd owned since before the war. Answered his own phone, walked to the store, told people who asked for an autograph, "I'm just Harry now." Harry Truman was blunt, principled, and proudly unpolished. He didn't court power, he tolerated it. He didn't dodge decision, she stared them down. And when he finally stepped aside, he left behind a presidency built on backbone, plain talk, and one very well-used piano. Next up, the general who became president. The man who warned about the military-industrial complex while mastering it. A military icon with a secret sweet tooth and a legendary temper hidden behind the calmest grin in Washington. Dwight D. Eisenhower is next, and the weirdness is about to get strategic, sugary, and surprisingly spicy. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower was a 5-star general who commanded the largest amphibious invasion in history and still had time to obsess over golf scores, boiled steaks, and the exact temperature of his shower. He was calm on the outside, thunderous on the inside, and ran his presidency like a battlefield. Organized, strategic, and with just enough weirdness to keep everyone guessing. Let's start with the grin. Eisenhower's grin was legendary. Warm, wide, and often paired with those famous arched brows, it made Americans feel safe. But beneath that smile, a volcanic temper. Ike could explode. He cursed in code, used "damnation" like punctuation, and had to keep a stress ball nearby to stop from breaking pencils during meetings. He rarely yelled, but when he did, even the White House walls flinched. He was a health nut, sort of. Eisenhower battled high blood pressure, heart issues, and a near-deadly heart attack in 1955. His solution? Boil everything. He boiled his steaks, boiled his vegetables, even had toast made with barely any butter. His doctor put him on a low-fat, low-sodium, low-fun diet. Ike followed it like gospel, except when it came to sugar. He had a raging sweet tooth. Candy, cakes, pies, you name it. His favorite was prune whip, which is exactly as glamorous as it sounds. He'd sneak cookies between meetings, stash candy in drawers, and once had the kitchen prepare emergency brownies during a budget crisis. Nothing cuts through Cold War tension like a frosted square of chocolate resolve. Ike was also obsessed with time. He wore watches like armor, two at once sometimes. He once stopped a meeting because the wall clock was 2 minutes slow. He tracked minutes like they were missiles measured, deployed, and not to be wasted. His daily schedule was divided into 15-minute blocks. If someone ran long, they didn't get invited back. He also painted landscapes, still lifes, self-portraits. He started late in life as a way to de-stress. He even converted a White House room into a makeshift art studio. One aide said, "He paints like he plans a military campaign. His brushstrokes, efficient, his palette, conservative, but he took it seriously and gave paintings as gifts." Eisenhower was deeply superstitious. He believed in lucky pens, trusted gut feelings, and carried a small charm his mother gave him in his pocket. He called it "my silent advisor." He also avoided the number 13, wore lucky golf socks, and never shaved before a major decision. Speaking of golf, played constantly. Over 800 rounds during his presidency. He had a putting green installed at the White House and famously painted squirrels red to keep them off it. That's right, red squirrels. He called them the communists of the lawn. Joking. Probably. He hated the telephone, thought it was an intrusive device, preferred memos, hand-delivered notes, or face-to-face meetings. Once said, "If it's not important enough to walk over here, it's not important." Eisenhower was also the only president to preside over peacetime with a 5-star military rank. He balanced global strategy with domestic calm, interstate highways with Cold War diplomacy, and somehow still found time to worry about paint colors. He even chose the specific tan for White House wall snow called Eisenhower beige. He ended his presidency with a warning. In his farewell address, he coined the term military-industrial complex and cautioned against unchecked power. It was thoughtful, haunting, and surprisingly philosophical for a man known for troop movements and tea times. When he retired, he went to Gettysburg, built a modest home, and farmed, literally farmed, with tractors and everything. He raised cattle, gave tours, and spent his afternoons reading westerns and writing letters by hand. Dwight D. Eisenhower wasn't loud, theatrical, or deeply ideological. He was tactical, structured, and full of quiet strangeness. A general who loved sweets, a warrior who painted flowers, a president who warned about war while carrying 5 stars on his shoulder. And when Ike passed the torch, it landed in the hands of a man with movie star looks, TV-era swagger, and enough Cold War tension to sweat through the most televised forehead in political history. John F. Kennedy is next, and the weirdness is about to get fast, fragile, and photogenic. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was the first president born in the 20th century, and he ruled like he knew the camera was always rolling. Young, charming, and painfully good-looking, he brought Hollywood to the White House and turned politics into a performance equal parts poetry and pain. But behind the clean-cut grin and polished speeches was a man held together with secrets, steel braces, and enough medication to rattle like a pharmacy. Let's start with the health. Kennedy looked like a golden boy tan, athletic, ready for a yacht club photo shoot. In reality, he was chronically ill. He suffered from Addison's disease, a rare adrenal disorder, and had chronic back problems so severe he often wore a brace under his suit. He had ulcers, colitis, and was in constant pain. His personal medical cocktail included amphetamines, steroids, barbiturates, and painkillers. He once received 3 injections in one day just to make it through a press conference. But you'd never know it. Kennedy cultivated an image of vitality. He played touch football, swam, smiled like he wasn't aching in 7 different vertebrae. The the secrecy was deliberate. In the 1960s, a president admitting chronic illness was like waving a white flag to the Soviet Union. He was obsessed with appearances. Every speech, every photo op, every moment was choreographed. His suits were tailored to disguise his back brace. He practiced smiles in mirrors. His press conferences were masterclasses in charm, delivered in a clipped Boston accent that made even hard policy sound like banter. And then there was the hair. Perfect. Every day. Thick, windswept, a marvel of mid-century follicular engineering. He combed it obsessively, carried multiple brushes, and reportedly had his barber on speed dial. One aide claimed JFK once delayed a meeting because his part wasn't presidentially aligned. Despite the polish, Kennedy was a chaos magnet. He thrived on adrenaline-fast cars, fast boats, fast women. He kept the Secret Service up at night. He would vanish into the night on spontaneous drives or boat rides, often without telling anyone. They called it Code Houdini. He was also a compulsive doodler. During high-stakes meetings, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, he'd scribble shapes, words, and names across his notepad. Ovals, initials, arrows. Some pages looked more like conspiracy walls than official documents. JFK was deeply superstitious. He carried multiple Lucky Charms, an old PT 109 tie clip, a rabbit's foot, and a small St. Christopher medal. He believed certain shoes brought good luck, refused to campaign on Friday the 13th, and he lit candles for his dead brother every year on the anniversary of his death. He was a voracious reader, plowing through several newspapers a day and finishing books in a single sitting. He once read from Russia with love in one afternoon, then called Ian Fleming for advice on dealing with the KGB. Fleming suggested some Bond-style tactics. JFK laughed and took notes. His desk was a monument to clutter. Photos, totems, letters, and paperweights. But he knew where everything was. He once found a note buried under a month's paperwork in under 5 seconds, then used it to corner a senator during a vote. And yes, the affairs. Marilyn Monroe, Judith Exner, countless whispers and confirmed liaisons. JFK kept a Rolodex of contacts and had a secret entrance to the White House for late-night visits. He once joked to a friend, "I get a headache if I go more than 3 days." The White House was Camelot, but the bedroom was Studio 54. Still, he was sharp, insanely sharp. His wit could cut glass. His speeches were lean, elegant, and devastatingly quotable. "Ask not what your country can do for you" wasn't a fluke. It was who he was: an orator, a dramatist, and a mythmaker who knew exactly how to light a match and walk away from the explosion in slow motion. When he was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963, the nation didn't just lose a president. It lost a symbol of youth, hope, and possibility. The world froze. The cameras blinked. The myth became history. And after Camelot collapsed, the country turned to a man with hound dogs, bourbon breath, and a political style that felt more like a fistfight in a barn than a policy debate. Lyndon B. Johnson is next. And the weirdness is about to get big, loud, and brutally Texan. Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson didn't walk into a room, she stormed into them like a Texan weather system. Tall, brash, and louder than a thunderclap on a tin roof, LBJ was a man of contradictions. Brilliant and crude, compassionate and terrifying, idealistic and ruthless. He could charm, bully, flatter, and steamroll in the same sentence. His presidency was an operatic blend of civil rights triumphs, Vietnam quagmires, and deeply personal weirdness that made even his closest aides occasionally question reality. Let's start with the treatment. That's what staffers called it. Johnson would invade your personal space, stare you down, whisper in your ear, shout in the next breath, jab your chest with his finger, and overwhelm you with anecdotes, flattery, threats, or legislative trivia until you broke. He once held a senator by the lapels and said, "You're gonna vote my way, son, because if you don't, I'm gonna tell your mama why you don't want kids to read." LBJ conducted meetings in bathrooms, not next to bathrooms, in them, while using the facilities. Doors open, aides trailing behind, with clipboards. If he needed to pass legislation, he'd do it mid-flush. He didn't see it as odd. He saw it as multitasking. "When I've got a man's attention, I don't let it go," he said, even if that meant delivering policy briefs while shaving his chest. Speaking of grooming, Johnson was obsessed with grooming products. He had a custom-made shower with multiple nozzles, including one that sprayed directly at his nether regions. He had his barber on standby at the White House and preferred to be shaved with a straight razor while sitting in bed. His phone calls were legendary. LBJ had multiple phones installed all over the White House, including one in the dining room, one on his nightstand, one in the bathroom, and one in his ranch pool. Yes, a waterproof phone, installed in a floating box, so he could bark orders from the shallow end. He was also, famously, obsessed with his body, especially his, well, let's say he frequently and unapologetically discussed the dimensions of his anatomy. He nicknamed it Jumbo, talked about it in meetings, and once asked his tailor to make more room in his pants for Iton, a call that was recorded. It's surreal, it's real, and it's peak LBJ. And Yeth was a legislative genius. No one, before or since, has passed more major domestic legislation in less time. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid. The war on poverty. He twisted arms, cracked skulls, metaphorically, and remade American society, all while swearing like a sailor and eating barbecue with his fingers. He also had a soft spot for animals. His beagles, him and her, became White House mascots until a photo emerged of him lifting one by the ears. Public outrage followed. LBJ's response? "That dog's fine. Hell, he liked it." The man was unapologetic about everything. He slept just 4 to 5 hours a night, took afternoon naps instead, scheduled meetings at 6 a.m., called senators at midnight, and ran his staff into the ground. They called it LBJ time. No one knew what day it was, just whether or not they were currently being yelled at. He was insecure about how he followed JFK. He kept a bust of Kennedy nearby, constantly referenced him, and worried that despite all his work, history would never love him the same. "I'm just the son of a bitch who got things done," he once said. He was right. And wrong. LBJ chose not to run for re-election in 1968. Vietnam was bleeding the country dry, and he was exhausted. He retired to his Texas ranch, where he grew his hair long, gained weight, and reportedly watched Gunsmoke while eating chili straight from the pot. When he died in 1973, the nation mourned a complicated giant, a man who fought for justice while waging a deeply unpopular war. A president who changed the country and never stopped yelling while he did it. And when LBJ stepped down, the country turned to a man so paranoid he recorded everything, talked to paintings, and once stared down a nation with eyes that hadn't blinked since the Eisenhower administration. Richard Nixon is next, and the weirdness is about to get tape-recorded, waterlogged, and deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was a paranoid genius in a gray sweet equal parts, Shakespearean tragedy, and Cold War cipher. He sweat too much, smiled too little, and trusted almost no one. His presidency was a kaleidoscope of contradictions, foreign policy brilliance wrapped in back-alley schemes, deep insecurity buried beneath layers of calculated confidence. Nixon didn't just inhabit the office, he haunted it. Let's begin with the taping system. Nixon bugged his own White House, not because he loved transparency, but because he didn't trust anyone to accurately recall what was said, including himself. He recorded over 700 hours of meetings, phone calls, and muffled mutterings. His aides didn't always know. His visitors almost never did. The microphones were hidden in desks, lamps, telephones. Nixon's presidency wasn't just historicity, was a real-time surveillance drama starring himself. He was obsessed with enemies, had a literal enemies list. It included journalists, celebrities, politicians, and, allegedly, Paul Newman. The list was maintained by aides and cross-referenced with IRS files. Nixon once described the press corps as the most disloyal people since Judas. He didn't whisper about opposition, documented it with filing cabinets and color-coded threats. And yet, Nixon was a policy titan. He opened China, signed the first major arms reduction treaty with the Soviet Union, and created the Environmental Protection Agency. He proposed universal health care before it was cool, but none of that came with flair. Nixon governed like a man trying to pass a test while being followed by ghosts. He was also an insomniac, slept erratically, wandered the White House halls at night, talked to paintings, especially Lincoln's portrait. He believed Lincoln understood him. At 3 a.m., Nixon would sometimes pace in the dark, mumbling strategy to ghosts and ceiling tiles. Aides called it the midnight shuffle. His paranoia didn't stop at taping. He distrusted the Secret Service, the State Department, even his own cabinet. He would plant false information in memos to see who leaked it. He once had a staffer followed to confirm his loyalty. Nixon didn't hire allies, hired people who feared him enough to stay close. He had bizarre eating habits. Ketchup on cottage cheese was a favorite. He also loved meatloaf, saltines, and bizarre snack pairings like pineapple and tuna. He didn't drink much, but when he did, it hit hard. After a few drinks, Nixon would start pacing, ranting about enemies, and delivering impromptu geopolitical monologues that sounded like rejected Bond villain scripts. Nixon hated modern art but kept some around to appear open-minded. He didn't understand music, thought Beethoven was too emotional. He preferred silence, claimed music distracted him from thinking. His favorite sound? The whir of a tape recorder. And yet, in public, Nixon tried desperately to be relatable. The famous Checkers speech named after his dog was a full-blown emotional performance designed to save his vice presidency. It worked. America forgave him. But Nixon never forgot how close he came to political death. It hardened him. Watergate didn't start as a scandal, it started as a clumsy burglary by plumbers tied to Nixon's re-election campaign. But instead of cutting ties, Nixon tried to cover it up, lied, pressured, deleted. Until the tape's own tapes exposed everything. It was the ultimate self-sabotage. The president had bugged himself into oblivion. On August 8, 1974, Nixon resigned. The only U.S. president ever to do so. His resignation speech was awkward, formal, and devoid of apology. The next day, he boarded Marine One, flashed a double peace sign, and vanished into history, sweaty and unrepentant. He lived another 20 years, wrote books, advised presidents, slowly rebuilt his reputation as a foreign policy elder, but the stain never faded. The tapes were always there, his own voice, forever locked in looped betrayal. Richard Nixon was brilliant, broken, and profoundly weird. A man who trusted microphones more than people, who governed with suspicion, and who fell from grace with a thud heard across every living room in America. And when Nixon vanished behind that helicopter door, the nation turned to a man so gentle he once pardoned a turkey by accident, wore sweaters in the Oval Office, and smiled like every sentence might be followed by an apology. Gerald Ford is next, and the weirdness is about to get clumsy, candid, and quietly underrated. Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford never ran for president or vice president, but he ended up being both. He was America's accidental leader, a man who fell into the White House through a double whammy of resignation and scandal, and then spent the next 2.5 years trying to prove he was more than just the guy who showed up when the country hit rock bottom. Ford was warm, awkward, humble, and weird in ways so earnest they felt almost retroactively wholesome. Let's start with the clumsiness. Ford had a reputation for tripping, bumping, and falling, especially in public. It became a running joke, famously exaggerated by Chevy Chase on Saturday Night Live. But Ford was actually a world-class athlete. He played center for the University of Michigan football team, turned down offers from the NFL, and was a star skier and swimmer. His clumsiness was mostly bad luck, slippery stairs, and one unfortunate umbrella incident. Still, he leaned into it. "I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln," he quipped. America chuckled, and for once, the joke stuck in a good way. Ford was relentlessly normal, painfully so. He made his own breakfast, toast and orange juice every day, poured his own cereal, cleaned his plate. He preferred sweaters to suits and often worked in casual cardigans. When reporters asked about his wardrobe, he said, "You can think better with warm arms." Fair. He also chewed gum constantly. Mint gum, always. He said it helped him concentrate. During tense meetings, staff would track his jaw to gauge his mood. Fast chewing, bad sign. Slow and steady, we're okay. Ford's favorite meal? Pot roast with red jello and a tall glass of milk. His staff begged him not to serve it to dignitaries. He ignored them. Queen Elizabeth II? Pot roast. King Hussein? Pot roast. The man had a diplomatic strategy made of meat and nostalgia. And yet, he pardoned Nixon instantly, dramatically, and without warning. It was the most controversial decision of his presidency. He said it was for national healing, to end our long national nightmare. Critics roasted him. Supporters were confused. Historians still debate it. But Ford never backed down. He believed deeply in closure even if it cost him the next election. Ford also survived 2 assassination attempts in the same month, one by Charles Manson follower Squeaky Fromm, another by a woman named Sarah Jane Moore. Neither was successful, and Ford kept his cool both times. After the second attempt, he told reporters, "I'm fine, let's keep moving." It was peak Midwestern toughness, bulletproof optimism with a dental plan. He was deeply loyal. To friends, to family, to his dog Liberty, who often wandered into meetings and sat at Ford's feet. He had a soft spot for pets, and often took Liberty for solo walks on the White House lawn. One aide noted, it was the only time he looked truly relaxed. Ford also had a weird affection for swimming pools. He had one installed at the White House not for fitness, but for mental clarity. He believed laps cleared the mind. He'd swim every day, often without Secret Service nearby. The press once caught him emerging, dripping, smiling, and slightly confused about where he'd left his towel. He was the only president to serve without being elected to the executive branch. And he never pretended otherwise. He was humble, self-aware, and sometimes too honest. When asked about his legacy, he said, "I hope I'm remembered for healing, but I'll settle for being remembered." And when he left office, it wasn't with scandal or spectacle, was with a polite wave, a quiet plane ride home, and a sense that, for a brief moment, America had been led by someone who truly just wanted to do the right thing. Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was the president who once filed a UFO report, taught Sunday school while in office, and installed solar panels on the White House before anyone could spell climate change. He didn't smoke, didn't drink, and once fought off a giant swimming rabbit with a canoe paddle. His presidency was equal parts idealism and awkwardness, peanut farms and peace talks, cardigan sweaters and geopolitical chaos. Let's begin with the rabbit. In 1979, Carter was fishing alone in a boat near his Georgia home when a swamp rabbit swam toward him fast. Carter claimed it was hissing. He waved a paddle to scare it off. His staff didn't believe him until the photo surfaced. The press dubbed it the Killer Rabbit Incident. It became legend. Carter became the only president in history to be charged by a lagomorph. Carter was deeply religious, but in a weirdly personal, low-key way. He read the Bible daily, prayed before every major decision, and taught Sunday school throughout his political career even while president. He once led a Bible study group the morning after a national crisis. He believed politics should serve morality, not the other way around. This made him refreshingly earnest and occasionally baffling. He micromanaged everything. Carter didn't delegate. He dove in. He personally reviewed office schedules, planned his own travel routes, and read the fine print of legislative bills. He once edited the font size on a White House pamphlet. When told he could let others handle it, he replied, "If I wanted it done wrong, I would." His daily routine was obsessively structured. Wake at 5:30, run 6 miles, eat breakfast, read 40 to 50 pages of briefing material every day, no matter what. He tracked his weight, heart rate, and sleep hours in a journal. His handwriting was so neat, it looked like a font. The military gave him the code name Deacon. It fit. He was the first president to talk about renewable energy seriously. He had solar panels installed on the White House roof, wore sweaters during televised addresses to promote energy conservation. He turned down the White House thermostat and encouraged Americans to do the same. He caught flack for looking weak, but decades later, he looked like a prophet in wool. Carter also hosted the first beer brewed in the White House's brother Billy's namesake, Billy Beer. Jimmy didn't drink it, or anything. He preferred sweet tea and peanuts. So many peanuts. He was the first president to actually be a peanut farmer, and during his campaign, it became a branding bonanza. Carter peanuts, Carter hats, Carter smiling next to sacks of legumes. The puns were endless. And then there were the UFOs. In 1969, Carter filed an official report after seeing a strange object in the sky. He never claimed it was alien, but he never ruled it out either. As president, he requested briefings from NASA and the military. When asked later, he said, "I don't laugh at people who say they've seen UFOs. The Pentagon probably did." He had zero tolerance for showboating. He gave straightforward speeches, dressed plainly, and refused to stage photo ops. He smiled, but only when he meant it. He believed transparency was a virtue. The press found him boring. He found them shallow. Foreign policy? Complicated. He brokered peace between Egypt and Israel with the Camp David Accords. It was historic, difficult, and intensely personal. He also presided over the Iran hostage crisis, inflation, and an oil shortage. By 1980, America wanted flash. Carter offered competence. When he lost re-election, he didn't rage, he shrugged, and then went on to become the most effective ex-president in history. Built homes for the poor with Habitat for Humanity. Monitored elections around the world. Won the Nobel Peace Prize. Got brain cancer, beat brain cancer, then went back to building homes. Carter is still alive, still humble, still out there hammering wood, teaching Bible verses, and politely reminding America that decency isn't weakness, it's endurance. But when he left office in 1981, he was replaced by a man who once sold war bonds on screen, survived an assassination attempt with a quip, and somehow made "Morning in America" sound like a commercial for destiny itself. Ronald Reagan is next, and the weirdness is about to get cinematic, homespun, and eerily well lit. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was the only U.S. president who could deliver a line like, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," and actually make it sound like the climax of a movie, because for him, it was. A former Hollywood actor turned Cold War cowboy, Reagan brought cinematic swagger to the Oval Office, mixing old-school charm with teleprompter-perfect delivery. But behind the smooth baritone and grandfatherly squint was a man of strange habits, selective memory, and just enough Hollywood weirdness to make even his Secret Service raise an eyebrow. Let's begin with the acting. Reagan was a B-list film star before he was a politician. He appeared in over 50 films, most famously as George Gipp in Knute Rockne, all-Americana role that earned him the nickname the Gipper for the rest of his life. He wasn't method, he wasn't Brando, but he had presence, timing, and could deliver cornball one-liners like they were Shakespearean daggers. He treated the presidency like the most important role of his career. Every entrance was timed, every speech was lit just right. He rehearsed addresses with cue cards and practiced in front of mirrors. He didn't memorize lines, she owned them. Aides once joked that Reagan didn't need a press secretary, he needed a director. He believed in astrology. Deeply. After John Hinckley Jr.'s 1981 assassination attempt, First Lady Nancy Reagan hired an astrologer to help schedule Ronald's appointments, travel, and public appearances. His daily calendar was vetted against lunar cycles and planetary alignments. Staffers went along with it because if Mercury being in retrograde kept the president alive, who were they to argue? Reagan also had a sweet tooth that could cause cavities on sight. He was obsessed with jellybeans, kept jars of them everywhere, the Oval Office, Air Force One, cabinet meetings. His favorite? Black licorice. He ordered them by the ton literally. At one point, the White House was receiving 300 jellybeans a month. Diplomats were greeted with candy. Policy came second. He napped daily, not just power naps full, unapologetic snoozes. He believed rest made him sharper. Staff adjusted meetings accordingly. If someone woke him up, it better have involved missiles or a global catastrophe. Even then, maybe wait until he finished his REM cycle. Reagan had a photographic memory for stories, but a foggy one for details. He often retold the same anecdotes in speeches, sometimes changing key facts. He'd mix up movie plots with real-life history, sometimes quoting lines from films as if they were personal experiences. When corrected, he'd smile and say, "Well, it sounds better that way." He also wrote letters. Hundreds. To fans, to critics, to children. Reagan believed in handwritten responses. His penmanship was loopy and inconsistent, like a man writing from memory and momentum. He wrote with emotion, with humor, and sometimes with complete detachment from current events. He adored horses, spent hours riding at his California ranch, cleared brush himself, wore jeans and flannel like a man who'd never heard of California's film industry. He believed manual labor kept him grounded. The press dubbed it cowboy cosplay. Reagan called it just being me. And then there were the one-liners. After being shot in 1981, his first words to the surgeons were, "I hope you're all Republicans." When asked how the Cold War would end, he replied, "We win, they lose." His humor was simple, disarming, and often left critics fumbling for a comeback. He hated broccoli, banned it from Air Force One. He once said, "If I could pass a law against it, I would." This wasn't a joke, it was executive-level vegetable rejection. And yet, Reagan's policies were complex. His economic strategy, Reaganomics, mixed tax cuts with massive military spending. He championed a tough stance on communism while signing historic nuclear disarmament treaties. He cracked down on drugs while winking at Hollywood. He expanded presidential power while delivering speeches about small government. Contradictions were baked in. He left office at age 77 with high approval ratings. Soon after, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. In a heartbreaking public letter, he wrote, "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. It was pure Reagan, gentle, cinematic, and emotionally devastating in under 20 words. Ronald Reagan wasn't just a president. He was a performance half cowboy, half oracle, fully aware of the camera's gaze. And as the credits rolled on Reagan's 8-year epic, America handed the next scene to a man who once vomited on the Prime Minister of Japan, loved skydiving into his 90s, and whose kinder, gentler nation was occasionally interrupted by wild swings in policy and tone. George H.W. Bush is next, and the weirdness is about to get preppy, polite, and occasionally projectile. George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush was a Connecticut-born Texan who skydived into his 80s, called everyone pal or fella, and once wrote a thank you note to his own dog. He was the most resume-qualified president in modern history: congressman, ambassador to the UN, CIA director, vice president, and yet his presidency was defined as much by quirky expressions and polite awkwardness as by global upheaval and military action. Let's start with the vomit. In 1992, during a state dinner in Japan, Bush suddenly slumped forward and vomited into the lap of the Japanese Prime Minister. It made global headlines. It was caught on camera. He fainted, got up, joked about it later. The Secret Service called it Code Brown. America called it unforgettable. Bush was known for his quirky language. He spoke in shorthand nicknames and half-phrases, like a polite cartoon version of a military dad. He called his wife Barbara, Bar. Called Reagan, the boss. Called broccoli, I'm done with that stuff. He referred to his political enemies as kinda not helpful fellas. It was like he was trying to keep politics family-friendly, even when sending troops into Iraq. And yes, the broccoli. Bush absolutely loathed it, declared war on it publicly, banned it from Air Force One. I do not like broccoli, he said. And I haven't liked it since I was a little kid, and my mother made me eat it. And I'm president of the United States now, and I'm not going to eat any more broccoli. The broccoli lobby was furious. Kids across America rejoiced. He also loved socks. Wild ones, colorful ones. He once wore red, white, and blue socks to meet veterans, wore neon green ones to a baseball game. After leaving office, his sock collection became a trademark. When asked why, he said, "They make people smile. That's enough." Bush was a prolific letter writer, long handwritten letters filled with emotional honesty. He wrote to staff, friends, enemies, his wife, his children, even his dog Millie. He once penned a heartfelt note to Bill Clinton, welcoming him to the White House and wishing him well. No other outgoing president had ever done that so graciously. It's now considered one of the most honorable moves in modern political history. He also loved skydiving. His first jump came during World War II when his bomber was hit and he bailed out over the Pacific. He survived, got addicted, celebrated his 75th, 80th, 85th, and 90th birthdays by jumping out of plane soffits strapped to a Navy SEAL. When asked why he kept doing it, he said, "Why not?" Bush was deeply into sports, played baseball at Yale, threw out the first pitch at countless games, had a personal batting cage installed at Camp David. Even while dealing with Gulf War logistics, he'd sneak in baseball stats and football scores like they were national priorities. And then there was the Gulf War, his biggest foreign policy moment. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, Bush assembled a 35-nation coalition, launched Operation Desert Storm, and executed one of the most efficient military campaigns in history. He stopped short of invading Baghdad, believing it would destabilize the region. For a moment, he had a 90% approval rating. But at home, recession. Broken, no new taxes promises. A rising Democratic star named Bill Clinton. By 1992, America wanted change. Bush seemed old school, too humble, too traditional, too restrained in a world that was speeding up. He lost re-election, left the White House quietly, wrote more letters. In retirement, he went fishing, skydived, sent emails in all caps, became best friends with Bill Clinton, raised millions for disaster relief, grew weirder, warmer, and more beloved with age. He lived to see his son become president, and when he passed in 2018, the world remembered him not just as a war hero and statesman, but as a genuinely kind man in a famously unkind business. And when Bush stepped aside, America embraced the saxophone-playing governor from Arkansas, who brought MTV energy, midnight cravings, and more political charisma than the White House had seen since Kennedy. Bill Clinton is next, and the weirdness is about to get fast-talking, fast food-fueled, and saxophone-slick. Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton came into the presidency like a political rock, star charismatic, fast-talking, and armed with a saxophone solo that somehow made late-night television cool again. He was the first baby boomer president, and he carried the full weight of the MTV generation, fast food rappers, and a sax-playing heartthrob swagger into the Oval Office. Clinton wasn't just a president, was a full-blown phenomenon. And, like any great phenomenon, he was also profoundly, endlessly weird. Let's start with the saxophone. Clinton played it live on the Arsenio Hall show during his 1992 campaign wearing sunglasses and blowing through Heartbreak Hotel. It was political theater of the highest order. And it worked. Suddenly, the idea of a president jamming on late-night TV didn't seem impossible, it seemed inevitable. That moment cemented his image. Relatable, talented, slightly ridiculous, and completely different from anyone who came before him. Clinton was obsessed with McDonald's. He once said he could smell a McDonald's from 5 miles away. The Secret Service had to plan motorcade routes around fast food temptations because if he saw golden arches, there was a real risk of an unscheduled drive-through detour. He loved Big Macs, fries, egg. McMuffin's food pyramid was basically a golden triangle of grease and joy. But he had a brain like a blender on high. Clinton could read a policy brief, a biography, and a scientific journal at the same time and quote all three back to you in 10 minutes. He had a near photographic memory. He remembered names, faces, hometowns, everything. One staffer claimed Clinton could recall where your kid went to college and what they majored in, even if you only mentioned it once 2 years ago. He was also a sleep mutant. Clinton reportedly thrived on 3-4 hours of sleep a night. He stayed up until 2 or 3 a.m., making calls, reading memos, watching SportsCenter, or just thinking. He worked late and then got up early, powered by coffee, adrenaline, and possibly residual saxophone energy. Clinton was a walking contradiction. He was obsessed with fitness but loved junk food. He could deliver soaring speeches about empathy while struggling to empathize in personal relationships. He believed in government's ability to do good, but constantly compromised to keep it small. He governed like a man who was always negotiating with himself. He also had a serious Elvis fixation. He owned Elvis memorabilia, quoted Elvis, danced like Elvis. He even said he wanted to be Elvis when he was younger. The White House was briefly one gold lame jacket away from Graceland East. His office was messy, like apocalyptically messy. Piles of papers, scattered notes, leftover snacks. One aide described it as a brain dump with a furniture budget. But Clinton knew where everything was. Somehow. You'd ask about a specific report, and he'd pull it from a pile like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a paper mountain. He had an uncanny ability to connect with people, like emotionally download them. Whether it was a farmer, a CEO, or a crying intern, Clinton locked in like you were the only person in the world. People left meetings with him convinced they had changed his worldview. Sometimes they had. Other times, he just made them feel like they had. That was the magic. And of course there was the scandal. Monica Lewinsky, the impeachment, the blue dress, the finger-wagging denial. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. It was Shakespeare meets soap opera. The details were salacious. The fallout was immense. Clinton survived it politically. Barely. The public didn't love what he did, but they liked the economy more. Despite the chaos, Clinton's approval ratings were consistently high. He left office in 2001 with one of the highest post-WWII ratings in history. People weren't sure if he was a genius, a rogue, or just a really good salesman. The answer, probably, was yes. And when he finally stepped off the stage, saxophone slightly dented, suit slightly wrinkled, he passed the torch to a familiar name with a different tone. A son of a president, a Texan with a swagger, and a man who once choked on a pretzel while watching football. George W. Bush is next. And the weirdness is about to get twangy, tongue-tied, and surprisingly tender. George W. Bush. George W. Bush was the president who once declared, "I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully," and meant it. A man of malaprops, brush-clearing ranch rides, and post-9/11 gravity, he somehow oscillated between frat house humor and presidential wartime pathos sometimes within the same sentence. He was a political legacy with a Texan twang and a talent for turning the simplest sentences into abstract poetry. Let's begin with the Bushisms. No president in modern memory has generated more accidental one-liners. They misunderestimated me. Rarely is the question asked, "Is our children learning?" I know how hard it is for you to put food on your family. These weren't jokes, they were real and frequent. Staff kept track. Late-night TV had a field day. Bush didn't seem to mind. He once joked, "I'm the master of low expectations." He had a distinctive walk, part cowboy swagger, part linebacker warm-up. It wasn't just a posture, it was a brand. When Bush walked into a room, you heard it. Belt buckle shining, arms slightly wide, like he was always prepared to wrangle a wayward goat or answer a trick question about foreign policy. Despite the tough guy image, Bush was emotionally expressive, especially in private. He teared up easily, hugged freely, prayed regularly. He once cried during a Medal of Honor ceremony, and then again while reading letters from the families of fallen soldiers. One aide described him as a hard-on-sleeve president who tried to stuff that sleeve into a denim jacket. He didn't just read the Bible, he read Jesus. CEO. He had a deep, personal faith that shaped his decisions and rhetoric. He believed in moral clarity, good versus evil, and the idea that history had a purpose. He didn't intellectualize it, he internalized it, often to the frustration of critics who wanted nuance. His daily routine was built like a Texas sunrise, early, clear, and uncomplicated. He rose before 6 a.m., worked out with dumbbells or a treadmill, and read intelligence briefings while sweating through a t-shirt that said 43. He loved nicknames. Everyone got one. Karl Rove? Turd Blossom. Vladimir Putin? Pooty. Poot. His own father? Poppy. He was a magnet for strange incidents. Most famously, he choked on a pretzel while watching football in 2002, passed out, woke up with a bruise on his face, made a public statement about snack safety. America collectively blinked. He also dodged a shoe. During a press conference in Iraq, a journalist threw both shoes at him, considered the highest form of insult in Arab culture. Bush ducked them like a dodgeball champion and then, grinning, said, "That was a size 10. It was the most athletic moment of his presidency." He loved painting. After leaving office, he took up portraiture dogs, world leaders, veterans. His brushwork wasn't technically refined, but the sincerity was real. His gallery exhibit, Portraits of Courage, was surprisingly moving. Critics who once mocked his syntax now praised his stroke work. Despite launching the Iraq War and overseeing the post-global shift, Bush still seemed, to many, like a man who'd rather be clearing brush in Crawford, Texas. And he did a lot. That ranch wasn't a set piece. He genuinely spent hours working the land, cutting trails, and driving his pickup truck with the same intensity he once drove domestic policy. He was polarizing, often underestimated, and undeniably strange. His second inaugural address referenced the untamed fire of freedom. His post-Katrina response was famously tone-deaf. His reaction to 9, standing on the rubble of the World Trade Center with a bullhorn, was deeply unifying. He was full of contradictions. And when he left office, the economy was collapsing. The wars were dragging on, and the nation seemed exhausted. Bush boarded the helicopter quietly, without bitterness, waving like a man who'd aged decades in 8 years. But waiting in the wings was a man with soaring rhetoric, a Nobel Prize, and a calm so precise it could be mistaken for surgical. The first black president. The no-drama candidate. The man who followed the storm with silence and a teleprompter. Barack Obama is next, and the weirdness is about to get smooth, cerebral, and sneakily sarcastic. Barack Obama. Barack Obama was the president who made cool look presidential. He spoke in paragraphs, paused like a novelist, and wielded sarcasm with the elegance of a rapier. He could break down healthcare reform like a TED Talk, then pivot to dropping his March Madness bracket with the swagger of a sports analyst. But behind the smooth exterior was a president so uniquely methodical, so subtly quirky, that he once described his political opponents as sipping Slurpees on the sidelines, and somehow made it sound like foreign policy. Let's start with the voice. Obama didn't just speak, performed. His cadence was slow, deliberate, punctuated with pauses so long you could fit a filibuster in between. Every speech had rhythm. Every town hall had comedy. His mic drops weren't metaphors. He literally dropped the mic at his final White House Correspondents' Dinner. He was also a total nerd, deeply, gloriously nerdy. He read Spider-Man comics as a kid and quoted Star Trek as an adult. He named his dog Bo after musician Bo Diddley and possibly Bo Jackson, depending on the day. He watched Game of Thrones obsessively, screened Star Wars at the White House, and once admitted he'd read all the Harry Potter books before his daughters. Obama was surgically tidy. No drama, no chaos. His desk was always clean. His suits were mostly gray or navy. When asked why, he said he didn't want to waste decision-making energy on outfits. That wasn't a joke. He believed in decision fatigue and structured his day to avoid it. Same meals, same routine. He treated his mental bandwidth like a budget. He was a basketball fanatic, played often, fiercely, trash-talked like it was part of the Constitution. Staffers learned the hard way. If you challenged Obama on the court, be ready to get dunked on verbally or physically. He also had a left-handed shot so smooth, it looked like it came with a soundtrack. He was also a dad joke machine, unstoppable. He once said, "We're building infrastructure. That's a solid foundation, get it?" His comedic timing was dangerously sharp. The annual turkey pardoning ceremony? Goldmine. He groaned at his own puns while his daughters rolled their eyes in synchronized agony. Obama loved lists, reading lists, music playlists. He dropped curated Spotify mixes like they were foreign policy briefings. From Nina Simone to Kendrick Lamar, he had taste, deep taste. He once invited Chance, the rapper, Beyoncé, and Lin-Manuel Miranda to the White House in the same day. That wasn't a party, that was a cultural summit. He also loved policy, deep, nuanced, fine-print policy. He was known to dive into 50-page memos and write notes in the margins. He'd ask follow-up questions that required staff to re-research their own research. He was often the smartest person in the room and tried not to act like it, usually. Obama was also deeply superstitious. He carried a set of Lucky Charms in his pocket rosary beads, a small Buddha, a poker chip, and a tiny statue of Hanuman, a Hindu monkey god. He said they reminded him of the people he met on the campaign trail. Also, they helped. Probably. He had a strange relationship with his own image. He joked about the ears. A lot. He once said, "I was born in Kenya. Just kidding," during a speech after years of birther conspiracy nonsense. He handled trolls with sniper-level sarcasm. No rage, just shade. And he cried. Not performatively, quietly, deeply. When speaking about Sandy Hook, when talking about his daughters, when referencing civil rights leaders whose shoulders he stood on. His tears were rare, but never fake. Obama left office with a complex legacy. Record deportations, the killing of Osama bin Laden, the Affordable Care Act, and the rise of Trumpism in his shadow. He remained graceful under fire, even as the world grew increasingly chaotic. When he departed in 2017, he handed over the reins to a man with gold-plated buildings, a Twitter addiction, and a taste for superlative sand. Nothing would ever be quiet again. Donald J. Trump is next, and the weirdness is about to get louder, longer, and like nothing history has ever seen before. Donald J. Trump. Donald J. Trump wasn't just a president, was an algorithm in a red tie. Loud, litigious, ever-trending, and completely impossible to ignore. A real estate mogul, reality TV star, and branding machine who turned the White House into a non-stop media spectacle. He didn't follow the script. He tore it up, live-tweeted the pieces, and sold hats made from the confetti. Let's begin with the tweets. Over 25, 0 of them. Policy by Twitter, insults by Sunrise, praise for dictators, and rage against department stores. Trump tweeted at 3 a.m. during meetings, mid-flight, mid-crisis, and sometimes mid-sentence. Capitalization was optional. Random quotation marks were frequent. His feed was a chaotic blend of personal vendettas, breaking news, and bizarre declarations like, "I have the best words." He never owned a pet, not a single dog, cat, or ferret. First president in over a century to go animal-free. When asked, he said, "I don't have time." Which checks out between cable news marathons, endless rallies, and golf outings. It's hard to squeeze in a walk. Ah, yes. The golf. Trump played more than 250 rounds while in office. Bragged about his swing. Hosted world leaders at his clubs. Watched Fox News in the clubhouse. He even awarded a Medal of Freedom to golfer Tiger Woodson, the 18th green of public perception. He also loved fast food. Genuinely. Big Macs, KFC, Diet Cokes by the dozen. He once served a full spread of McDonald's, Wendy's, and Domino's to the Clemson football team at the White House. Called it Great American Food. No irony. He reportedly thought it was safer to eat prepackaged food because you know what you're getting. Trump was a germaphobe. Extreme. Avoided handshakes. Used hand sanitizer constantly. Once refused to press an elevator button. He believed in clean hands, strong walls, and winning. He communicated like no president before him, largely because no president before him had come from a world where branding mattered more than governing. His name was on steaks, vodka, universities, and a board game. He turned political messaging into reality TV cliffhangers. Press briefings felt like episodes of The Apprentice with national consequences. He also spoke in loops. Aides called it Trumpian rhetoric, repetitive, hyperbolic, tangent prone. It's gonna be great, really great, like nobody's ever seen. Many people are saying, I alone can fix it. These weren't gaffes, they were features. It was performance art powered by confidence and volume. He redefined the concept of a rally. Giant crowds, red hats, teleprompter optional. He riffed, joked, attacked, praised, all in one breath. His rallies were part sermon, part stand-up, part campaign war dance. He played the crowd like an arena rock band with unlimited encores. And then there was the hair, the tan, the look. Trump's physical presentation became a cultural meme of its own. Late-night hosts, impersonators, and SNL built entire seasons around the way he pointed, stood, squinted. Trump didn't just enter a room, he colonized it. He was impeached twice. Once for withholding aid to Ukraine in exchange for political dirt. Again for inciting the January 6th insurrection. Both times, he was acquitted by the Senate. He wore impeachment like armor, spinning it into fundraising gold and rally fuel. After losing the 2020 election, Trump refused to concede, claimed widespread fraud without evidence. His supporters stormed the Capitol. It was the first time the peaceful transfer of power had ever been physically disrupted. 5 people died. Democracy held but shook hard. Even in post-presidency, Trump remained omnipresent. Rallies, investigations, social media bans. Then, his return via his own platform. He became the first ex-president, indicted in multiple cases, and the first serious contender to run again under such legal shadow. Donald J. Trump wasn't just weird. He was unprecedented. A political big bang, a hurricane wrapped in a brand, powered by controversy, and filtered through 1,000 memes. And now, the current chapter brings us to a man who whispered his way into the Oval Office, rides Amtrak like a religion, and ends his speeches with, "Not a joke," folks right before saying something no one was sure how to interpret. Joe Biden is next, and the weirdness is about to get folksy, fragile, and full of whispered intensity. Joe Biden. Joe Biden is the president who whispers into microphones, wears aviator sunglasses like they're part of his skeletal structure, and says, "Not a joke," right after saying things that sound very much like jokes. He's a throwback politician running in a modern world, a human time capsule who spent more time in Washington than most Americans have spent alive. Folksy, gaffe-prone, intensely empathetic, and occasionally so meandering he loops back on himself mid-sentence. Biden is equal parts grandfatherly comfort and narrative chaos. Let's start with the whispers. Biden has a signature rhetorical move. Mid-speech, he leans into the mic, drops his voice to a hush, and delivers a phrase like he's letting the country in on a national secret. Pay them more. This is Infrastructure Week. It's half ASMR, half campfire ghost story, and it happens so often it's practically a motif. And then there are the aviators. Biden wears Ray-Bans like a Secret Service agent cosplaying as a beach dad. He wore them during campaigns, motorcades, and even inside on cloudy days. When asked why, he once said, "They're cool. Can't argue with that." He's obsessed with Amtrak, rode it for decades, knows the schedules, knew the conductors by name. He once told a story more than once, actual about how he logged over 2 million miles on Amtrak. The math was fuzzy, the vibe was pure Biden. For him, trains aren't transportation, they're emotional metaphors. Biden is deeply tactile. He's known for hugs, shoulder grabs, and whispering into ear soften, all in the same greeting. It's affection in overdrive, the byproduct of a politician who built his career on emotional connection. Post-COVID, this became complicated. The hugs got fewer. The air kisses more awkward. He also loves ice cream. Visibly, audibly, passionately. He has a standing order for chocolate chip cones. Photos of him eating ice cream are their own genre. If he were in a crisis bunker, there'd probably be a scoop of Breyers on standby next to the red phone. His speeches are full of Biden-isms, long digressions, personal anecdotes, occasional stumbles, and repeated catchphrases like, "Look, folks, here's the deal," and "Not a joke." These verbal detours are part of his brand: sincere, rambling, occasionally incoherent, always earnest. He's a grieving man. Biden lost his first wife and daughter in a car crash in 1972, lost his son Beau to cancer in 2015. These tragedies didn't break him, they rewired him. He talks about grief, often, publicly, unscripted. When someone suffers, Biden meets them with eye contact, silence, and words that sound like they're being pulled from a well. And then there's the gaffes. Biden has said bizarre things, a lot. Poor kids are just as bright as white kids. You cannot go to a 7-Eleven unless you have a slight Indian accent. I may be Irish, but I'm not stupid. Sometimes they're harmless. Sometimes they're historic footnotes. He once called himself a gaff machine. The self-awareness helps. A little. He's also a legislative dinosaur in the best and weirdest ways. He tells stories about working with Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms like he's reminiscing about old high school buddies, forgetting that half of them were political supervillains. But he believes in bipartisanship like it's religion. Not because it works, but because he refuses to believe it shouldn't. Biden's domestic habits are delightfully ordinary. He loves his dogs, Champ and Major, though Major had some biting issues. He drives a vintage Corvette Stingray. He wears Rolexes like Timexes. His favorite food is pasta. His greatest joy? Sunday dinner with family, followed by watching The Godfather again. He came into office during a pandemic, after an insurrection, at age 78, the oldest person ever elected president. He was sworn in on a Bible so large, it looked like it should be kept in a dungeon beneath the Vatican. His presidency has been a blur of infrastructure, vaccines, inflation, and constant reminders that this is going to take time. Joe Biden isn't flashy. He isn't eloquent in the traditional sense. But he is weirdly persistent, like a steam-powered empathy machine lumbering through modern politics. His weirdness is generational. His vibe? Scranton uncle with a surprisingly strong handshake. And so the list ends for now. From wooden teeth to sax solos, bathtub mishaps to jellybean diplomacy, these presidents weren't just leaders. They were walking, breathing anomalies of history. 50 men. 50 flavors of strange. But America wouldn't have it any other way.